Good evening. We're going to go ahead and call this meeting to order. Dr. Foley, roll call.
Vice President Reese, members of the board, please let the record show that all members are present. We have 4 in person, and Mrs. Kaler is joining us by phone.
Thank you. We're going to have a moment of silence followed by the Pledge of Allegiance. All right, we'll move on. I move that we approve the agenda.
Second.
Any questions or comments regarding the agenda? All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Thank you, Mrs. Kaler.
That was very clear, Mrs. Taylor.
Oh, was it too loud?
No, you came through fine.
All right, we're going to go on to the superintendent's report. Dr. Foley?
Vice President Reese, members of the board, tonight we're excited to start with some celebrations and acknowledgments. And so we're happy to start with our points of pride. We know how much our governing board loves to celebrate our students, our community, our employees. So I would like to share with you tonight how we're going to kind of approach this a little differently. So we're doing our first points of pride since last February. And we're going to do it a little differently tonight. So what will happen is tonight we'll be joined by our principal who will come up. Mr. Bickle will come up and he will acknowledge one recognition at a time. What we're going to do is have a panoramic picture style. So you will stay where you are and smile beautifully so we can see you without your masks. And they will stand here social distance and we'll acknowledge them. So we'll invite Mr. Bickle to come up and we'll do one award at a time and panoramic picture for this time. So we're modified recognition, but we're excited to rejuvenate and do this again as a team. So Mr. Bickle, can you join us?
Yes. President Kaler, Vice President Reese, members of the board, cabinet, thank you for having us today. Should I take my mask off? Should I not? Okay, I'm going to leave it on for right now. So I would like to invite our first point of pride up today, and that will be, he wanted to go first. So let's go with Vincent Zamora. Come on up, buddy. Vincent is an extremely hardworking student who is excelling in all areas of his studies. Vincent always has a positive outlook and attitude towards school. He advocates for himself to achieve his goals, but also helps others to do the same. He is kind, caring, responsible, a friend to everybody, and always has a smile on his face. He is a great example to his friends and peers at school, as he sets an example of excellence in behavior, cooperation, and thoughtfulness in interactions with others. Vincent makes every class he is in better. Great job, Vincent.
Vincent, we'd love to get a picture with you.
Next, I would like to call up Amy Moyer. Amy is our volunteer point of pride. So Amy is being recognized as Bridges Volunteer Point of Pride due to her amazing dedication to our school and community. Mrs. Moyer joined our campus PTO last year and has continued to serve on the organization's board again this year. Amy's unwavering positivity, can-do attitude, dedication, time, effort, and cheerful smile have made it a pleasure to work with her. We are so thankful for her energy spent in helping make Bridges better for the students, staff, and community. Thank you so much. Kristen Seedig, please come on up. Kristen is our teacher point of pride. Thank you, Chris. One would have a very difficult time to find a more knowledgeable, professional media specialist than Kristen Seedig. She continually goes above and beyond for her students in school. Kristen is always collaborating with other staff members to enhance the curriculum for all of her students. She is relentless in making sure that every student has their needs met. I love going into the library or computer lab and watching her teach because she brings the curriculum to life and enriches her students' learning experiences. Kristen leads the Battle of the Books Challenge every year for the students at Bridges to participate in. She definitely has a positive impact on the students she interacts with as she continually looks for ways to build relationships with them. I am looking forward to continuing to work with Kristen as she thrives on building leaders at Bridges while motivating all to reach their potential. Congratulations, Kristen. Last but not least, Mike Barbadillo, please come on up. Sherry, I believe you hired Mike at Power Ranch way back in the day, and so we were able to steal Mike to come on over to Bridges when we opened up, and he's been with us ever since. So I'm gonna read off the paper, but Mike has been an integral component of our campus custodial staff as he's served as the lead custodian since our inception 5 years ago. While Mike does a wonderful job of cleaning our campus and ensuring it's sanitized and prepared for students and teachers alike, it's his positive, fun, caring, and charismatic attitude and personality that makes him truly special. Mike is always willing to go above and beyond for the benefit of our students, staff, and community. Examples of this include his willingness to always help with setup and breakdown at events, thinking of and implementing ideas for school improvements, building props for the school play, arriving at school at 6 a.m. to help pass out teacher shirts as a surprise, even though he was scheduled to work the late shift that night, providing candy and cupcakes randomly for the teachers, and always being a relationship-oriented teammate that brightens everyone's day. We cannot say enough positive things about Mike and who he is as a person, and with that, we are honored to celebrate him as our support staff point of pride this year. Thank you, Mike. Thank you, everyone.
Vice President Reese, members of the board, we have some upcoming events, and we'll let the calendar show that the month of November, next week we have Veterans Day, we have upcoming meetings, and we have a school visit, which we're very excited about this month too. So we've got a busy November ahead of us.
Thank you, Dr. Foley, and congratulations to everyone at Bridges for their points of pride. Nice to do recognitions again, COVID style.
COVID style.
All right. Board comments. Mrs. Wilson?
Let's see, where were we this week? We had the ASBA county meeting, and that's for board members, and we were actually awarded, our board was awarded some professional development. We had a lot of professional development hours. I can't remember exactly what the award was called, but we did get an award, which I thought was kind of exciting because we've been in such long professional development hours. I also attended the Cooley football game, the first one of the season, and those principals were out there telling the people with their masks, and it was amazing to see parents coming together on the field to watch their kids. And then also I went to Williamsfield Higley game. Mrs. Reese was also there, and Mrs. Kaler was also there as well, and a good game.
Mr. Glover?
Yeah, sure, thanks. Well, I think some things happened last night, so I wanted to future welcome and congratulate Ms. Schultz, Ms. Anderson, and Ms. Reese on their elections and re-election to the school board, and thank Mr. Wojtovich. I mean, I think we're still waiting for finalization, but and if congratulations are, you know what, I should have really thought those remarks out before I said them. But 20 years, 2 decades of service in Michigan and here, and I wanted to thank you take a moment to thank you for that. I also wanted to mention about the voters and the people of this state and this community who, when they are asked, consistently support public ed. And it's really easy to feel down as an educator when some of the remarks and comments you hear around about teachers, you know, getting back to work and all this sorts of stuff. It's easy to feel bad, but just lift yourself up and recognize that Prop 208 passed, and what that means for you personally as a educator, educational professional, what it means to the school district, and mostly what it means will mean to our students. So again, thanks to the community who again consistently support when they are asked. They put their money where their mouth is for public ed, so we can feel proud of that as educators.
Thank you. Any other comments, Mrs. Kaler?
Mrs. Reese?
Yes.
Yes, I too want to echo Mr. Glover's comments, welcoming 2 new board members to our community, Mrs. Anderson and Mrs. Schultz, and also your reelection, Mrs. Reese. And as I talked to Greg a little bit earlier today, he's maybe now in full retirement mode instead of partial. And I too am grateful for his many years of service, especially to HUSD. So I couldn't go through the night without saying those words. Thank you.
Thank you. And like Mr. Glover said, we are waiting for finalization of all of our election information. But as it stands now, that is what it looks like. And Mr. Wojtovich has served our community proudly, I think, for 6 years now. So we will wait and get the finalization and go from there. So it was an interesting night, to say the least, a little bit different for our elections. So any other board comments? All right, then we will move along. Mrs. Reach, any requests to speak? Okay, we have no requests. So we're going to go on to the consent agenda, and I move that we approve the consent agenda as it's presented. Any questions or comments regarding any items on the consent agenda?
Mrs. Reese?
Mrs. Kaler?
Just a couple of things. One, I just want to thank Mrs. Martin for filling a kind of hard spot to fill in the middle of the year, which was a Spanish teacher. I was confused when I read the board packet, so my apologies to her. She knows what I'm talking about. But really happy that we were able to secure a Spanish-speaking teacher in the middle of a semester. And then also 6.5, the list of qualified evaluators. I think there's been a conversation in the past, and I just kind of want to reiterate that any teacher needing a different evaluator that might come their way, that those are definitely conversations that the board welcomes for our teachers. If there's any kind of personality conflicts or professional differences, we just want to make sure that our evaluators are also lined up with the appropriate teachers. And then my last, I guess, little question is, how are we evaluating our online teachers this year? Thank you.
Vice President Reese, members of the board, President Kalar. It's a good question, and I will be honest and say we don't have all of the dynamics worked out, but we were fortunate that Strong, who we currently use in terms of our evaluation system, did send us a few weeks back some guidance in relation to remote learning and online learning and how we can look to put ourselves in the classroom and still evaluate. It's going to be different with our elementary because our online learning looks a lot like remote learning versus our secondary where that's asynchronous and where we're going to have to sit down together and talk a little bit more about those standards. So I've already I've already discussed part of this with Mr. Lotzenheiser, and we're going to be going from there and meeting with our secondary principals in terms of what other tips and tricks, for lack of a better word, we continue in that line with our online components. So I don't have all the answers, but we're working on it, and we can update you in a superintendent's report.
I just wanted to say thank you to our elementary special teachers who are putting in all this extra time. They're getting a stipend tonight under 6.2, and I just want to thank those teachers who decided to step up and put some extra time in to make the online work. And so just thank you to all those teachers.
That's a good point, Mrs. Wilson. I don't think people realize that we have a lot of teachers who are doing both elementary and our middle and high schools. We have a lot of teachers that when the ask went out, because we wanted to try and provide as much as we could in our online environment and really try not to be limited for our children, we had a lot of those teachers step up and answer that call. So thank you for pointing that out, and we appreciate their hard work. And so I hope that we continue to recognize them.
And I do know there's a couple 6/5 that we've already approved before, but thank you for those. And I even heard a couple 7/5. Is there a couple teachers who are doing 7/5? So thank you to all those teachers as well. I know we've said it every week, but it's really important to make these classes work for our kids, and they're stepping up when asked. So thank you.
And it's new territory for everybody. So they're paving the way for sure. Any other comments or questions regarding consent? All right, all those in favor?
Aye.
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 Motion carries 5-0. All right, we're going to go on to action and information items. I move that we approve the second read of policy IJOA, which is the optional student travel. Questions or comments regarding this item?
Just a few weeks, it was months ago now, that we had a work study on this. So if anybody's questioning what this is, they can go back to that work study. I think it was February, Dr. Foley is saying. So if anybody's questioning what we discussed and all the information, it's back in our February. It got a little pushed because of COVID, but it is there.
All right, if there's no other questions or comments, all those in favor?
Aye.
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 Motion carries 5-0. All right, we are going to go on to our facilities rental proposed rate increase. This is an informational item tonight. So, Dr. Fowler, this one's yours.
Yes, thank you. Vice President Reese, members of the board, I'm interested in sharing this information with you tonight. This is an item that I will bring back for vote at a future meeting. Just wanted to talk about a proposal to increase our rental rates. And I don't think we have a clicker, so would you advance the slide for me, please? Just a little bit of background. The purpose of really looking at an increase, as you know, we've had a number of increased costs related to COVID expenses and sanitizing. It's also an important revenue generator for the district, and it enhances our civic center funds that can be used by the district, but also for our schools. We're also looking to set aside some of these funds for individual campuses for beautification and also for some site discretion. We have looked at surrounding rates, comparisons with Chandler, Mesa, Gilbert, and Queen Creek, and also our rental rates have not been adjusted since 2017. Please advance. Just briefly explaining, there are 4 tiers in our rental agreement. Tier 1 being the teacher, staff, and student groups for activities and meeting purposes. Tier 2 or class, that is the class of students related to nonprofit organizations such as PTOs, boosters, youth organizations, or community sports leagues that serve our district students. Class 3 is the nonprofit organizations that are not student related but include churches, community organizations, or HOAs, or other political organizations, including elected officials or sports leagues. And then finally, class 4 would be any for-profit commercial companies or individuals. And then looking specifically at those tiers, we're not recommending any changes to tier 1, which was our staff members. Tier 2 is the area where we're looking at the most of our increases, predominantly in the area of gymnasium rates, and you'll see the adjustments there for elementary, middle, and high school, and then also for our football field rental, and then a custodial fee increase, and then also an increase to the opening and closing fee. The opening and close fee is just a one-time fee that's charged each time for an event, and the custodial fee is an additional charge to the rental that's provided. Tier 3, it's the custodial fee and the open and close fee that we're recommending for increase. And tier 4, the same, the custodial fee increase and the open and close fee. And just addressing the revenue sharing with schools, going back a number of years, Higley used to share the Civic Center funds with schools, and in previous leadership that had changed, and it's our recommendation to get back to the place where we share the revenue with the sites. We did, in our comparison, look at surrounding districts in terms of if they share their revenue, and we found that all of our surrounding districts do share their revenue, and that's at a rate between 25 and 50%. And so we'd like to begin providing our schools with a 30% share of the rental revenue, and propose to do that beginning in January of 2021. Again, that I think is something that would really be beneficial for our campuses in terms of the beautification, and then also give some discretionary funds for our sites to make some decisions to do some items that, as you know, the budget is limited, so that give them an opportunity to enhance what they're provided at their campus. And I'll answer any questions at this time.
Dr. Fowler, I have a few questions.
Yes.
So for our PTOs, can you explain when they would have to rent their facility? Do you know? Because they were listed in the tier 2 group.
An example might be maybe there's a special clinic that they're putting on as a fundraiser that goes beyond maybe what their coach is doing, or maybe a special event that requires them to use our facilities. I wouldn't think that it's often a time that we rent them out to them, but there is a process if they want to use it for special events.
So that's not including their regular meetings, that's not including any campus stuff, the festivals or anything like that. That's if they're choosing to do like a fun run outside of a school time, open up to the community type fundraiser.
That's correct, yes.
Okay. And then my other question is, I understand the need and how important our facility rentals are. I have a concern, though, that we're not putting our schools and our students first. And as of late, I've heard lots of concerns on groups and clubs having a hard time getting space that they would normally have access to because we've rented it out. And again, I understand that additional revenue and the importance it is for our district and our campuses. However, they're our students campus first. And so is there something in place, especially as we look to potentially change these rates, that we can have more guarantee, if you will, for our own students, our clubs, our sports? When I'm hearing that our own sports teams are getting kicked out of their gyms because we rented that space out and it's normally their practice time, that's a concern for me. So I want to make sure that as we do these rentals, that we're making sure that we're not taking that away from the students that are already on that campus. So is there something we can look at putting in writing there?
Vice President Reese, I agree with you completely, and we do have it in our policy for facility rentals, and so if there's individual cases, certainly our extracurricular programs would take precedence over any rental facilities, and so we shouldn't be renting facilities at the expense of any student practices or club groups wanting to meet, and so if those are situations we can talk offline, I can address those, but no, the use of our facilities is for our students and our clubs and our groups. The rental part of our facility would be after available times that are available, that they're not being used by our clubs and groups. So we should not be taking opportunities away from our students and our clubs. And so I agree with you completely. And in fact, that's something we work with the sites on in terms of the approval process, and then just adding a couple extra layers to make sure that that isn't occurring. So
Okay.
I'm completely in support of what you're stating, and that is how we're supposed to function. This is in additional to any openings that we have is when we would rent it. We're not going to rent it at the expense of or the cost to practice time or opportunities for our students on campus.
Perfect. So as this goes through, if we can just continue to remind our sites of that as we're dealing with rentals, and whether it's through community ed or our sites. Again, I get this rental income is very important. It is a way for us to be able to provide some additional things to our campuses, and that benefits our students, but it shouldn't be at the cost of our students. So as we look at this, if we can just kind of keep that in there too, please.
Vice President Reese, members of the board, one of the things that I would like to share in addition to this is in the theme of processes and procedures that is deeply aligned to our strategic goals here as a board. One of the things that sort of brought forth the need to look at the fees here was, what are our processes and procedures for facility rentals? Let's write them down. Let's go into detail, which caused us to look at practices and what we're refining and where do we need to update. In fact, we've created a PowerPoint to kind of go through this process with principals, and in learning recently about some issues where there were some siloed communications as we're refining this, even an additional approval process involving the athletic director before a facility is rented out, so there's a final check and a site approval first. We're fixing those processes and procedures, which brought up the need for looking at these fees, because again, this is our civic center fund, and we need to make sure that it doesn't cost us to do that. And this needs to, again, we don't want to be the most expensive, but we also don't want to lose money. So we were kind of looking at this as a Goldilocks rule, not too hard, not too soft, but just right. What's the market value? So you'll see that we had done an analysis of others and where were we off in our own rentals of this, where would we recommend improvement. So two-part, processes and procedures and how we're renting, and then the fees. And tonight we're looking with you at the fees where we saw we might need to make some adjustment when we do rent them.
Perfect. Thank you. Mrs. Kaler?
Yes, I was just going to say that Dr. Foley and I had talked this last week about some of these very things because a situation came up, and we want to make sure that we are taking care of our own first and foremost, especially those of our boosters and sports and things that parents are investing into our fields and into their programs. And then if you have somebody come in and that doesn't take care of it the way we do, it's very disheartening. So I commend Dr. Foley for getting a meeting together right away and trying to make sure that we, moving forward when it comes to community ed, that there is a more communication between all parties involved. Thank you for that.
Will we get a chance to see this presentation before we vote on this item? The presentation you were talking about that you're going to give out to principals on the order of, is there a way that we can maybe see that before we vote on this?
And again, two pieces. Vice President Reese, Member Wilson. Yes, two pieces. The presentation for the principals is really for them to know their process for what we're going to follow. What we could do is, because it's not connected with its processes and systems, not fees. So this is a fee item you'd be voting on, but what we can do is put it in a superintendent report for you to see. The presentation that's being provided to principals, we also could do it as an information item, and we could talk about what those processes and procedures are. But for voting, this would be for the fees, and we would only be recommending, as you saw, which one's in the tier. So the good news is in our analysis, there weren't very many recommendations of adjustment we were making. We just needed to make sure we weren't losing money in the costs that it cost to open, to close, to clean, to staff it through community ed.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And the only reason I brought it up is that if we do even need to look at higher fees because we may have more restrictive time. I mean, that's the only reason I brought that piece up at the same time with the fees. So if we're comfortable with the amount of available time we have for outside rentals, if we're taking care of our own, and that these fees will cover our costs and help support the schools a little bit, then that's what I'm asking. Thank you. Any other comments, questions? All right, thank you, Dr. Fowler.
Thank you.
Then we are going to move on to our 7.3 quarterly special education day school report.
Vice President Reese, members of the board, one of the things that we put in earlier this year was that we would do quarterly updates on an item that you had already approved, just to give you information on where we were in the spending of that, so that you can monitor that as a quarterly basis. And so this is the summary of, again, what we have spent thus far. Obviously, there was an approval of amount higher than that. And if you have any questions, we would have Mrs. Miller provide the answers for that. But this is a quarterly information update, as we promised would be back to you on a quarterly basis.
Thank you. Mrs. Miller, just briefly, can you just go over so that our community can understand that we have students that we are responsible for educating, that in some instances we can't keep in-house? And so can you just briefly explain what these expenditures are for?
We have a very small group of students that have special education needs, that the IEP team makes the determination that those needs would be best met in a facility that specializes in the type of need the student has. As you can see on the board, these are all of the private day schools that we currently use, and all of them service kids with varying disabilities. Some students that go to one would not be able to go to the other based on their need. So once the IEP team makes that decision, those students are placed there, and we pay a tuition for them to attend. We still do collect their ADM, but part of that is used to fund the tuition for the private day school.
Perfect. And just to clarify, typically the ADM we collect does not equal the cost of what we are paying for a private tuition for the education for these children. Is that correct?
Unfortunately, that is the case.
Okay. And then this is much lower than it used to be, because we have moved, with your help and guidance, we have been able to move more services within our schools to serve our special need population in our own schools.
That's correct. This is right now of sitting at about just under $800,000 less than what we've paid in previous years.
Perfect, thank you. I appreciate the information here. Anyone have questions?
Mrs. Miller?
Wilson?
I just wanted to say thank you because I know that this is your baby and you take really good care of it. And I never worry about these kiddos because I know you always take really great care of them. So just thank you.
I appreciate that. Thank you. My team is pretty amazing, so.
I was just going to add the same thing. Thank you very much, Mrs. Miller, for all you do in special education. You're a great communicator with our parents and our students and staff, and I appreciate your information for us. Thank you.
All right, then we will move on to 7.4, our Human Resources Quarterly ESI Report. Ms. Martins?
Good evening again, Vice President Reese, members of the board. Similar to what Dr. Foley said in regards to the update of information related to Ms. Miller and her special education area, this is the same underneath Human Resources. The board approved us to use ESI as a vendor for our substitute teachers as well as our rescue subs back in May, June for this fiscal year, and this is where we're at right now. We've totaled paid out at about $64,000, and the amount approved was about $1.2 million, and we have about $1.1 still left. It's early, although we've finished first quarter. The billing of that component actually does take a little bit of time too, in terms of processing and doing all of the reports. In addition, I'd like to note that this also includes our rescue subs, which is new this year for us. We have not had rescue subs in the past, but because of the concern related to COVID and absences happening throughout the district, we did create rescue subs at all of our sites. Unfortunately, there's one site where we have not been able to fill that position. However, we've been able to fill them at all of our other sites and seem to be operating fairly well.
Ms. Martins, have we had, I understand we haven't been able to fill out the site, the permanent rescue sub. Have we had issues getting subs from ESI at all?
I would say that the issues that we've had is more along the lines of we have subs, but they don't always want to work. Depending on the circumstances, the time, I would say the culture and climate of what's happening with COVID, if their numbers are increasing, there's individuals who have decided and opted that they're not comfortable when we reach out to them. Unfortunately, we've largely been okay. There were a couple of weekends where it was a Monday-Friday situation where it was a little difficult, but otherwise we've been able to maintain it and or pull subs from one site location to another site location.
Thank you. Any other questions? Okay. Then we will go on to 7.5, the review of the 2021 and the 2022 budget preparation calendar. Dr. Foley?
Vice President Reese, members of the board, I am pleased to have Mr. Jeff Gadd share with you. We're going to do just an information item to show you we are being really intentional and thoughtful about bringing information in this unique budgeting year with a schedule so that you can anticipate what we'll be bringing in when, so that there is plenty of time and information for us to make important staffing decisions in an interesting year. Finding out, again, you'll kind of see he's going to kind of talk you through what we'll be bringing each meeting so that we are working toward having contracts out to our employees by our normal time in March, and what we will be doing together to prepare for that, as well as conversations that will be happening along the way for us to make important other decisions when it comes to if we call for elections or not, what our priorities are. They're all kind of connected and part of some of the additional items that we're going to discuss tonight on the agenda as well. So he is here tonight to kind of talk through kind of what you can expect at each board meeting that we're going to be bringing to you budget information wise, so that you and the community are aware of the work that we'll be doing from the finance department.
Madam President, members of the board, this budget calendar is fairly detailed, as you can tell. It has some significant milestones and dates in it. I believe all of the dates here are board meeting dates, so it's intended to be an update for you at each one of the board meetings. As Dr. Foley mentioned, there are several goals with this calendar. It allows us to do, thank you, it allows us to do the teacher contract issuance process March 10th. And of course, that's intended, as you well know, to try to attract and retain teachers earlier than others might, and gets us with less, we'll wind up with fewer openings at the end. It also creates a planning process for capital outlay. It's got a review process of the current capital budget that's granted to the district on a per student basis. That's district additional assistance for some of you who may be into that topic for a while. And then it also talks about, as you can see in February, after we've passed the capital budget that's granted to the district annually, it then shifts to a review of what overall capital needs do the district have, and what the board would like us to pursue relative to elections. The subject of elections is pretty important because most districts are unable to satisfy their needs with simply the annual capital budget. It just is not enough money. It's also money that has been taken, some of that money is taken back by the state that still has not been fully restored. So the capital outlay budget override will be discussed later on in this process, and then we'll try to couple that up with a discussion of a potential bond election. By having both of them side by side, because both are interchangeable in terms of what you can use the money for, it's helpful to get the planning process where all of it's in front of you rather than just pieces. So you kind of know what's available, and if you're going to schedule it or plan for it in multiple funds, you can do that because there'd be three funds at this point: your regular capital budget, your capital outlay override, and your bond. And that relates back to some lease payments, I think, that the district is currently making from O&O. Most districts are not doing that, as you well know. And obviously, those monies could be spent on program. And maybe we can figure out a plan, that's our hope, to maybe restore some of those funds back to M&O and not do that significant $6 million annual transfer to capital. This state spends, as you know, somewhere in the neighborhood of 49th in the country as to how much it spends per student. And the last thing you'd probably want to do is to erode that low spending level by use of that capital money when it's intended for your operational budget. So you can see the outline here. We will be bringing to you at the next meeting a projection of next year's budget, and some of these are not easy to come by. They are assumptions and they are projections when you're this early in the year, and some of these budgets are reliant upon what happens with the economy. So it's got some complexity to it, but I think that it's better that we talk about it and have a planning process than not. And I don't think any of us want to have surprises if we can help them back in the spring, or not have for the board options that they've told us about that they want to implement for next year. And so it works, I think, both ways. I would point out a couple of key dates. June 9th is the last date that the board can call for a capital outlay or a bond election. And that would be held the following November. So if that capital planning process, the calendar is intended to try to get some different scenarios in front of you to look at to see if you want to pursue the election process. But that date comes fairly early. So you have to have first studied it to know what you want to do the first part of June in order to have that option then in November. The November option, remember, even if you schedule an election and it's successful, you won't have the funds until the following July. So you're talking 21, 22, and 22, 23, I guess, in terms of implementing it, except for the bond election, which you can have funds earlier because that's a sale process and not a tax rate process. I think that kind of summarizes it. You'll find that we have 4 meetings in this schedule dealing with M&O, and that is the budget of concentration at the front of this schedule. And the reason for it is what I just mentioned. It's the issuance of teacher contracts. So if you're going to approve a salary schedule and authorize that contract issuance process in March, we're going to be talking to you very soon about what we think the projected monies will be in M&O, what we think the obligations might be in M&O for next year, and we've done that on 4 different board meeting dates. And so we would encourage you to, after we have that review, each of those meetings, to let us know what you want as additional information or some things that you see that you don't want to pursue. That's a good time to tell us, and we'll know then from a planning standpoint. Once the M&O budget is underway, then you will start to see capital outlay show up. And that's going to be a planning process that deals with the regular annual capital budget the district has, and then we'll try to focus at the end of this calendar on the capital outlay override and the bond. I think that you'll find the process extremely educational and helpful, and you'll feel that you've had plenty of time to study what these issues are and can give us some direction accordingly. So with that, Madam President, anything that you want to ask, I'll try to answer for you.
Dr. Foley, can we make sure Mrs. Anderson and Mrs. Schultz gets this information as well? Yep. That if in fact they are joining our board in January and we have a lot of informational items before then, I think it's important that they receive that.
Absolutely. Vice President Reese, yes, we will make sure that they get that information. And what we thought was that this is very important too, because it will allow the board and community to hear information 3 times in a public forum prior to any decisions being made. It will also allow us to have information along the way to have community forum or staff feedback and employee information along the way too. So this is a really transparent calendar of progress as we work toward that. So we'll make sure that our potential new board members have this, as well as everyone's aware that this is our plan.
Any other questions, comments? Mr. Glover?
Always, but only 2 more times after this. This isn't really, you don't have to pay too close attention, Mr. Gadd. This is more probably for, I'm going to talk about evaluation process a little bit. It is a tight market to try to find teachers, as you suggested, and so what districts have done is move them earlier and earlier and earlier and earlier. And so when we look at when evaluations have to be completed, it really is puzzling to me why we would, and I know that there are circumstances in which we have our eyeballs on certain teachers, but it seems to me that before we issue a contract, the evaluation process should be wrapped up, and we should have a simple enough process that can be done. And I'm not sure that's happening really anywhere. It seems like it sort of devalues the evaluation when here's your contract, and now here's your evaluation. Several weeks later. So that's just one thing. I really feel like those dates in an ideal world could match up. Also, I think this particular year, and it's kind of probably too late, but now would have been a really good year. School boards can simplify the evaluation process, and with all the pressure on our teachers, and sometimes in some of our classrooms, I know at other schools, I know of one instance, there's a class of 26 kids and 14 are either ordered quarantined or self-quarantining. So you have the teacher reporting to work every day, but it's also preparing work for those 14 kids in an online kind of environment the best that she can. So the stresses and the pressures that principals are feeling and teachers are feeling, it would have been nice to simplify it. But in general, my feeling on evaluations is they really could be simplified in Arizona, and it would be better for everybody. And we can really focus on the handful of teachers that we do need to focus on when we do need to focus on them, rather than doing everybody year after year after year after year. So, thanks.
Thank you. Any other questions? Thank you for putting this together. It's good to be prepared and know where we're going and have target dates and the expectations. So thank you.
Mrs. Reese?
Yes, Mrs. Kaler?
It's a tad off topic, but perhaps we could talk about just a brief timeline on our hiring process for our financial department real quick, because I know that that is happening right now.
Did you get that, Ms. Martins? I think she, let me help. I think she's talking about what your hiring deadlines and things are, your timeline is for hirings, right, Ms. Kaler?
Correct.
As it joins in with the financial planning dates.
If I understand your question correctly, Ms. Kalar, what we're doing right now in terms of looking at the broader picture, we are looking to plan a virtual job fair. We've done the in-person job fair in the past, back in February. So we're going to have our kickoff meeting this Friday to talk about what that would look like for us, as many other organizations are doing things virtually this year for different capacities. So if we follow the timeline in regards to getting our contracts out in March, which aligns with what we have done in the past during my tenure here, doing it right before spring break, so that way it could help the employee as well as the site administrators, so individuals who know that they want to move forward with us can sign their contract, return it. Those individuals who have an idea that they might want to leave can have conversations with their principals, and that way we can use spring break time to do some hiring in the bigger picture. So I will say it's unique in the sense that we are moving a little bit earlier this year than we have in the past, but I think it's for good purposes and good reasons, and will set us up better financially as we plan for all these other things and for our teachers to know in advance too. So if I understand that correctly, is that what you're asking?
It was kind of hard to hear, but I think so.
Okay, thank you. I apologize.
We can chat later too.
Well, and Ms. Martins, you're working obviously with us with this budget with Mr. Gadd on not only our contracts and our retention, but our future hiring needs and what you foresee. So you're having those conversations that will come into this calendar, so we still have the information for these deadlines on what you see our future need being and kind of what you need earmarked from a new employment standpoint.
Absolutely, Vice President Reese, members of the board. In regards to our timeline, like I said, we've shifted everything a little bit earlier. Previously, we would look for staffing requests sending out in December for January. We're doing it earlier. We're looking to do that out actually here in November, within probably the next couple of days or next week, asking them to return them in December so we can then align what we might think we need for future staffing with what current FTE we have. Something that Mr. Gadd has brought to us in regards to his expertise is really kind of taking an assessment and look back at our staffing standards. And we've been working this last few weeks in the HR team in regards to identifying the number of allocated FTE, the number of vacant FTE, as well as those that are filled FTEs at each site and department district-wide, and determining what those numbers look like in terms of size of students and enrollments in areas to where there could be potential shifts as a result based on what enrollment will look like next year and what we anticipate that will be.
Perfect. And then we'll see all that as these timelines and these dates come within our budget discussions. Thank you. Any other comments or questions? All right, we're going to move on to 7.6, which is the preschool proposed tuition increase for the 2021-2022 school year. It is not a legal conflict of interest, but I have a strong opinion of the viewed conflict of interest, so I will excuse myself for the conversation. Ms. Wilson will facilitate this part of the meeting.
Thank you. All right, I think you're up, Mrs. Gleason.
So,
Board
Member Wilson, members of the board, one of the things that and again, you'll notice there's a theme here tonight when we're looking at community ed, we're looking at processes and procedures, we're looking at an analysis of what we're offering, what does it cost us, how do we continue to offer it without it impacting other budgets, the need for this conversation. Again, this is an information item, but we have the lovely Mrs. Gleason and Mrs. Richards who want to talk with you about our preschool programs and their proposed tuition rates for us to vote on in a future meeting, but an information item tonight.
Okay.
We're excited to talk to you this evening, board member Mrs. Wilson, members of the board, President Kaler, cabinet, and community. I've got one word to express my gratitude to these early childhood development directors, teachers, staff members. So will you go to the next slide, please? This has been a very interesting year. We would have all not believed this a year ago. On March 23rd, we were forced to close our early childhood development centers due to COVID. But our teachers and our paraprofessionals did not stop. Under the amazing leadership of Ms. Gleason and Ms. Utley, they kept teaching their kids through an online platform. And this was during a time where we weren't collecting tuition. But these teachers wouldn't let go of the kids, and I think that says a lot. This continued because on July 27th, when our kids began remote learning, our preschool staff stepped up. They worked with Kids Club and food services. This went on from the July 27th date all the way to August 17th, when they had another opportunity to step up. That's when Governor Ducey said, "You will provide targeted services for students that need support." So once again, here comes Team Preschool to basically save the day. And they were very gracious. The kids and the families were so grateful. We are happy to announce that both Sossaman Early Childhood Center and Cooley received funding from the Child Care COVID-19 grant. And this was to bridge that gap in tuition that occurred. To date, each center has received $45,225. In addition, they are looking to receive another $15,075 by mid-November. So we just kind of wanted to frame the important role they play in our district. They get our kids ready for school, and those teachers are outstanding. So anyway, tuition is set for this year, but we're here this evening seeking a tuition increase for the 21-22 school year.
So our next slide this evening is showing our full day comparisons. So we wanted you to see what our surrounding districts are charging. And I did just realize that Gilbert is not on there, but I do believe in some additional materials that you have that Gilbert is in there. So I want you to notice that the hours per day for our days per week are 5 hours or 5 days per week. And then the hours per day does vary within the different school districts. And then of course the price per hour. And then if you would notice as well that our proposed tuition rate still leaves us very competitive as you look at other centers. And Gilbert, their full day is $720, and it's $5.14 an hour. Next slide, please. Okay, and then this slide shows our half-day comparisons. Again, a little bit more consistent there as far as the hours per day for each of the programs is 3 hours. Days per week varies just in Mesa. They have a 4-day-a-week program, but as you can see, the price per hour for each of those. And Gilbert's is, they charge $320, and it's $5.33 per hour. So our proposed rate still keeps us very competitive.
Okay, next slide.
Okay, and as we look at this slide, what we've taken is all of the programs that we offer in Higley for our families, and we wanted to show you those comparisons as well. There isn't another district that offers quite as many programs as we do, because we know that our community has a need for a variety of different programs, and we wanted to make sure that we're serving all of them. So you can see, again, the different rates. The hours per day are consistent with our full day, and our half days are all 3 hours per day. What we've really tried to do as well is to keep the increase under 10% for each of the programs. Okay, next slide, please.
All right. We thought we'd get you with this cute little girl here. Pretty much sums it up. Our staff members are very important to us, and we want to continue for them to receive a 20% discount. This equates to, for a full day program, $130 off per month. With the proposed increase, it would be $142 off a month. This is important because over the course of the year, obviously, currently, they receive $1,300 off a year. So we wanted to share that with you. Next slide. And if the little girl didn't get your attention, the sky does. So our staff members also have their registration fee waived, which is $75.
So why are we requesting an increase? Right now, this increase will ensure that the revenue will continue to cover teacher and staff salaries plus their benefits. The proposed increase will also enable us to continue to provide the quality learning experiences that Higley families have come to expect and the surrounding districts are trying to emulate. And this proposed tuition increase will continue to keep us competitive with our surrounding districts in neighboring corporate and private preschools.
In addition, I'm going to add something. I think that the retention rates we experience with these preschool kids staying in Higley, even if they're open, what we call open enrollment kids, is worth a lot. And we have a lot of our kids in our elementary schools that you can tell they've been in Patty's preschool. I'll call it Patty's preschool. But it's worth it when we start looking at that and the impact it has long-term for these kids. They're better prepared for school, not just kindergarten. All right.
I've actually gotten to see a lot of the kiddos when they do their kinder visit, because our preschool does a kinder visit for all those who don't know. If you're in our preschool, you get to go and visit kindergarten when you're in your last year. Am I correct?
Yes,
okay.
That's correct.
And they just are so cute, and they just melt my heart, and they're so excited to learn, and I get to see it. So it's really cool. I got to see it last year, and it was just really cool to see those kiddos and how excited they were about that. So thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions, Mr. Glover?
Mrs. Wilson, yep, thank you. Well, I've said before, and research supports this. Some of the best money you can spend is on early childhood education and all-day K in terms of academic success and growth and readiness. That being said, I'm a little bit sad. I understand it, and I support you, Mrs. Gleason. I do. People are really struggling financially, and so it gives me a little bit of heart palpitations as we're talking about raising rates. We don't know the economic outcomes of COVID, and I know when we run into situations where people are struggling, we always do reach out. So I do worry about that. I just want you to know that I am concerned about that. I know you are too. But we have a great structured program, as you said. We have certified teachers, and I will say again for the millionth time, I think it's the best program in the state for what these young kids and these families get out of it. So, I will support this, and I support you. And there you go.
Board Member Glover, thank you for acknowledging the quality of the early childhood program and the staff that we have who teach it. Highly qualified early childhood teachers working with probably one of the most valued early childhood educator as a director. So I honestly feel that, again, the quality of what we provide for early childhood in the Higley district is something that we can be very proud of. So thank you for acknowledging that. And we too share the same concerns about an increase. We're wanting to also make sure though that the community ed fund funds the teachers so that we can continue to offer and compensate them as we look at increases for the staff as well.
Has there been any discussion in reference to, as we increase, to raise the discount for our employees to 25% or 30%? I ideally would like to see it free, but that's another whole thing. But have we had that conversation to increase the, because I haven't seen an increase for our employees in a while.
I think Ms. Martin's going to speak on that.
Mr. Witovich, we have actually had lots of dialogue in the last couple of years related to this, but because of the IRS tax components, if we give more than 20%, then we have to tax our employees. So that's why we've stuck with the 20%. But I'm with you. That would have been a great option if we could have done that.
Unfortunately, in this case, thou giveth, thou must then take it away in a different way. Yeah.
President Kaler, did you have something on the phone?
I just wanted to reiterate a big thank you to our preschool teachers. They wore many hats this past year, and I'm very grateful to each and every one of them. I know they're happy to be back with their littles and not trying to tutor a 7th grade math student. Also, whenever I see a post or any kind of social media about our preschools, we get the top-notch praises across the land. And so hats off to Patty's Preschool and all those that are in support of these schools, because they really are, probably like Mr. Glover said, the best preschools in all the land. So thank you for all that you do. I know that this is a tough decision for all of us to increase any kind of fees right now. But just know, I think that you get the best bang for your buck with our preschools by far. Thank you.
Did anyone else have any other questions? All right, I think I'm going to go get Vice President, Mr. Glover will go get Vice President Reese. Thank you again,
so much.
Mrs. Gleason.
Thank
and
you.
They do wear the cutest little hats I have seen the hats that they wear for Halloween. They dressed up as crayons, so I got to see them as I dropped off at Cooley. So they had the cutest little hat on with their crayon outfit.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Maybe I should do a little sneak peek. Wait till you see the photographs of how they're focusing on kindness. So I'm giving you a little sneak peek.
Oh, it's good. Thank you.
Okay, we're ready to move on. All right, so we'll go to 7.7, which is information on instructional materials.
Vice President Reese, members of the board, I am actually so excited about this presentation. So I am going to ask if we'll pull up the instructional materials presentation. I'm also joined here tonight with Ms. Felicia Malloy, who will also be co-presenting with me. But I want to start off with just sharing with you how excited I am to talk about this. And we're going to venture back, although it feels like 100 years ago. I remember one of my very first or very second presentations to you last year was talking about standards, curriculum, and instruction, the why, the what, and the how. And tonight we're going to be talking about something else that I'm excited about, which is going to be the what. What do we do with our curriculum materials? But one of the things that was a huge priority for our district and for this governing board was processes and procedures and alignment to our policies, and we want these things written down, and we want templates and examples for them. So tonight we have something that we're excited to show you on the work that has been part of Ed Services with the team for the last year. And again, a lot of this was in works and ready to go, and then COVID happened, and so we finalized the process here and are bringing it to you so that you can see. So if you can move forward a slide, please. Okay, so we're going to talk about supplementals and we're going to talk about core, because these are both essential pieces and there's processes for both. And we're going to talk with you about the guidance document that we've put together. It's a handbook that helps guide our process, and you'll also see that we have a timeline that we're implementing with our next adoption that was on our cycle with the Science for K-12. So next slide. Going back to the who, the what, the why, and the curriculum standards, what we put up here for you is, and for discussion for the community is understanding, is the idea that instructional materials go hand in hand with teaching and learning. And there's the supplemental materials, and there's and the core materials. And when we talk about core adopted materials, what we're talking about is there's actually there's statute and policy that outlines the processes that governing boards and districts have to follow, because when you adopt a core program, that is something that you're adopting for everybody at that class or for that tier. So that's the tier 1. Supplementals, though, are also important, and they too have an approval process, but supplementals are a little different because they're based on need. One size, as we know, does not fit all. There is not one curriculum program out there that will fit the needs of everybody, and education has come a long way from the day where you open the book and you read the script. You know, we're truly, as we discussed in previous board meetings together, the standards guide what's happening in the classroom, the tools are the curriculum, and the teacher uses the data to meet the needs of students. And so, again, we do our very best to get a core curriculum that provides nutritional needs, but supplementals are what we use in Tier 2 and Tier 3, and they are based on the needs of the students. And of course, there's a process involved with that, but it looks a little different. So again, our tiers of support of instruction also align with the tools that we use and how we use them. Next slide. So again, going back to core materials have a different adoption process with them, and there's timelines involved in this with how you reach out and select them and work with vendors, how you review them with teams and processes, how you vote for them. There's a 60-day review before it comes to you as a governing board as an item that you actually vote on to approve. But you would want your curriculum team to bring with you the culminating work of this process where we would follow a process. So core adoption obviously have a different threshold of approval than supplementals would. And again, we have statute and policy that guides our handbook that everything's aligned to. Next slide. Now, supplementals are also, supplementals there tend to be more of because you're not buying them for every child, for every situation, for every school. It's on an as-needed basis. They too should have some level of curricular alignment and approval, but because of their very nature and sometimes how they're funded out of different grants or site funds, they do not go through you obviously approve them in a ratified voucher. You're aware of the expenditure, but the expense is not huge unless it's over $100,000 in which it would come to you per our policy. Normally, these are ratified. They're done through different grants, funds. They're intended for specific purposes. Ed services should know who, what, when, where, and why, but it's a different process because it's intended for a different use. The tool is really as needed. So when we think about supplementals and we think about core, they're both really important in how we use them. One of the things that we've worked really hard on in our district is figuring out what do we have and where are we using it and where are we in the adoption cycle. Because sometimes budgetary things happen that cause priorities to shift or standards change or needs arise or information causes us to have to look at our resources a little bit differently. So, thank you. On our website, one of the things you'll see that's been added to our staff, on our staff side, under the educational services side, are some great resources. One, the new handbook for the processes that we're using for our adoption process for core materials. And we'll talk about what that includes in here just a little bit more, but it's guidance as well as sample letters and what happens at each phase, so that not only does it keep it in alignment with the legislation behind adoptions, but also our policy, but also our internal processes and procedures written down. You'll also see two other lists. You'll see the elementary instructional materials that are listed by content area, identifying if it's an adoption or a supplemental that we maintain and oversee. We now have tightened our process so that all things, regardless of the fund for supplementals, Ed Services knows what we have and where we have it. Knowing that supplementals will not be identical at every school, it's based on need, based on student, and we want to make sure we're using the right resource for the right need. So again, this is something that is also now on our website that we're proud of. that has just been updated and modified so that it's there for our staff, and we'll also make sure people know that it's available. But what I'd like for us to do for a second is just talk with you what is in our handbook that we've kind of put together that's aligned to this, and how we're using this for our timeline with our most recent adoption that we're getting ready to begin the process for. But again, going back to why are we doing this and how does this all fit? Mrs. Malloy.
Thank you. So before we begin any adoption, we do need to look at all of our standards that are in the content area of that area that we're adopting. So how do we look at those standards? We assemble teacher teams, we assemble our instructional coaches. That all depends on the content area. Not every content area has an instructional coach, therefore it might be just a teacher team. And where we start with a strategic curriculum review. What is it that we're looking at as far as our standards, our focus standards? What are the key essentials that our students need to know? We then move to the curriculum revision, and that breaks it down by grade, content, and course. And then, of course, we move into that evaluation stage of the adoption of the materials. And the last phase, of course, is staff development.
One of the most important things to point out is that it is essential that the standards are what we start with when we go looking for. We don't go shopping before we know what we're looking for, and we get really intentional about what are we looking for, because what we find is that while no program is one size fits all, that we do a better job of picking a core program when we're really looking for a standards alignment rather than looking for something familiar to us. For instance, when we were looking at an adoption for ELA. One of the things we would look for is standards alignment, not necessarily story alignment, because you could go looking for a book that goes, oh, can I find the new version of what I've had, which would be a natural inclination to do. But if it doesn't meet the new standards, then what happens is we buy this and this and this and this and this. And not that we won't have the need for some supplementals, but we want to make sure that when we go looking for the core, that it's the best alignment to the resource that we have. And that's why it's a key piece of what we do our curriculum work, and then we go looking for what we need as much time as possible. So next slide. Going back to one of the priorities we had is write this down. What is our processes? What are our systems? So you'll notice that in that little handbook that we have that is attached to this agenda item, as well as on our website, this is our guidance for and how to do the establishing of the criterion rubrics that you use for evaluation. What do the letters look like to the vendors, to every step or phase of an adoption process? If you do it well, these are what it looks like and what it has to emulate. Down to the big part, which is also tightly connected with legislatively with how do you do the negotiation for the cost, because obviously that's a key piece, as well as the review and the votes from the sites and teachers, and the public display time period from the ordering and processing in a backwards design, so that there's plenty of time for receiving these items and training for teachers to look at this prior to implementing it. So again, it is truly a thoughtful process. And then obviously the professional development, which should be ongoing and something that's part of our growth with a tool. So again, you'll see that our handbook is kind of is a combination of both guidance and direction, as well as the actual forms that they could use as a template, so that we're being consistent in how we implement the process.
Dr. Foley, can I interrupt?
Yes.
So when we do the reviewed by teachers and parents, I understand that in the past, we've had a set of all the curriculums at the district office. Do we also provide another location for teachers and parents to review? Is it at every campus or just at the district office?
President Kaler, good question. And it's part of this process. One of the things you'll see is that we're requiring that vendors understand that not only do we need a set here for the district office, but a set of when you come down to the final two, both products go to every school site that would be impacted by the adoption. So for instance, if it was a high school adoption, it would be at both high schools. If it was a K-6, it would be at all K-6. If it was a middle school, it would be at both middle schools. So So depending upon the adoption that we're doing for the grade levels, every school site would have one of each of the things, the products that we were reviewing for those curriculum materials, as well as on public display. So that would be an important piece, so people can look at it and give feedback. Obviously, the one that's recommending will also be at the district office for the extended period of time, so that anybody who wanted to see it and didn't have to go to a site, we could do that. It's a component of the requirement of the adoption.
Dr. Foley, could we also get them at our preschools now that we've learned how great our preschools are and they feed into our elementaries? Having those preschool parents be able to view them, that might be a great opportunity as well.
And again, it would be depending upon if they were impacted by the adoption, we would make sure that obviously that was at the site. So again, the guidance document, it just provides, again, this resource for us to have. And so next slide, where I'll share with you kind of, again, there's phases to this. And you'll notice that this isn't just you start and you do, there are key pieces you need to have with each phase. And so there's a timeline that begins to put science, you'll see as an attached document to this, that shows how much work goes into each phase. So this is just kind of a general gist of the work that happens in each of these phases.
So there's actually 4 stages to the adoption. The first one is called the preliminary. We have the months there just as reference. The adoption process can start at any time. The preliminary phase would be the most important, and it's where the teacher teams are so critical. It is the most important. They will set the tone for the adoption. This is where they will get an outline if there have been any changes to the standards. So for instance, with science, we have been doing an update to the science standards already. And so it's going to be critical for us when we assemble that team together that we review all of those important changes to the science standards to make sure that they have an in-depth knowledge of those prior to even beginning that evaluation process. So that's your preliminary. We're assembling the team together and we're educating them based on those standards. Then if you'll move to the next slide, we move into phase 1 of the textbook adoption, and essentially the bottom line is we want to narrow it down from all of the great resources that are available down to a maximum of 3 or 4 publishers. And during that initial preliminary phase, the teachers will be establishing that criteria for looking at those textbooks. Next slide. Going on to phase 2, we're going more in depth. At this stage, we're looking at how will this textbook be used within the classroom. So now we're looking at all of the intervention that's provided in there, all of the enrichment that's provided within the textbook, and taking a look at the diverse needs for all of our students. Key here is the negotiation with the 2 final publishers. So at this point, we're trying to narrow down to 2. And unfortunately, one of our considerations is cost. So we've made sure that throughout all of this, that cost is listed in every phase, because it is not a good thing to arrive at the end and know that you can't afford the book that you want.
Right. So what happens is that we use the criterion for what do we need, what do we want, and what can we afford. And of that, and again, we want that alignment there, but we're not going to send something out for you to vote on to have you come back and say, we fell in love with this resource, oh, we're so sorry, we can't buy that. So again, that's why that's part of this phase 2 as we narrow it down to our phase 2. Next slide. We then go into phase 3, which is like, whew, this is where it gets down to the legislative pieces that we've got there. We have a vote from sites that bring recommendations, we get feedback. The final one, again, there's that 60-day review, so you've had, from the time we've made some decisions before we bring it for approval, we have 60 days, and then we make a recommendation to you to approve this. This being one of the things that makes it very different than a supplemental is the extended process and phases that happen prior to recommendation. But this is great because we can come to you as a committee that says, here is the work and what we've learned along the way and our support for this recommendation. Obviously, then upon approval, a recommendation is made, and then we begin working on the in-service and the receiving of the materials. So that's for phase 3.
Dr. Foley, can I jump into the weeds for a second?
Certainly.
This did happen, I think, with our math adoption, but it's important, especially as we're online more and more. But it used to be when you got textbooks, and then you got like a CD, and it was like, ooh, this is electronic. But now it's all online, and so you have Flash and all those things. So I know you know this, but just to point it out, to involve technology along the way, so you make sure when you adopt it that it is something that can be used, and we have the capacity and ability to, if an entire database of students needs to be uploaded. But that's so important now, and especially as we're mixed online and headed towards one-to-one. So just a technology plug.
Board Member Glover, that's absolutely appropriate. And here's the other, absolutely appropriate and so important. The other thing we've also learned, and you and I have had conversation about this too, in this era of technology, things, one, need to work with all of our tools. But the other thing is sometimes publishers promise you what a project will be eventually versus what it is right now. And so one of the things that is really important in the process when we're at phase 2, narrowing down to 3, is that we actually go in and look at, are these things just pretty packages that are going to happen eventually, technology, or do they actually really work? Because the last thing you want to do is buy something that is promised but not developed completely yet. So that's one of the things those of us who have done major adoptions have learned the hard way along the way, and it's a key piece to that. So thank you for that reminder.
And Dr. Foley, also real quick, kind of jumping in with Mr. Glover, there is, they showcase obviously their best part and what may be first year free. What we learned with our math adoption when Alex was included in when we purchased it, but then it was an ongoing purchase to continue to use it. And so again, like Mr. Glover said, I know you guys know all that, but it's just worth repeating and mentioning that especially, a lot of these publishers, they've already been working to move programs more online, more electronic, and that's happening even faster right now. And so, yes, it's important that we know what we're getting, what's an ongoing cost, what's included, and things like that. So when we start using a particular part of a curriculum that's not part of the core curriculum and you get used to it, some teachers use it more than others, then you kind of had to keep going. So I know I'm preaching to the choir, but it's something that we got caught up in for sure, and recently. So it's not like that's 10 years past. So it's worth mentioning that it's something, especially with science and things ever changing, that as we're preparing for science adoption, that we're fully aware.
Yeah, you got to keep in mind, textbook publishers are not altruists. They are in it to make money, and just remind the people on the committee of that.
They are. And hence you'll see when you look in the handbook, again, these just give some highlights basically, but when you look in the handbooks, you'll see the number of steps that are involved to help kind of coach and guide and to get the committee and team to really filter through these things so that it doesn't just accidentally happen. It's part of the process. And hence why we turned it into a guidance document as well as a, policy, processes, and procedures.
One of the other things that we did change, one of the initial things that we had on there was that we were going to have the publishers do presentations from stage 1. My experience has been that oftentimes you get snowed by the dog and pony show. So we have eliminated the publisher showcase until the final 2. Because then it really is looking at the standards. That's why that preliminary phase is so important, because if the teachers are aware of what the standards are and what our focus is, then they're looking at that textbook looking for those standards rather than looking at what's up on the screen and what looks ooh and ah. So that was a big change.
The shiny new car.
Absolutely. One of the other things that we did change was also we're initiating a parent group. So we will be asking for volunteers to a parent group so that we can also give some of that same education that we're giving to the teachers to the parents, so that this particular parent group can go out and talk to the other parents and say, hey, I got this training and this is what the new standards are. Maybe not to the depth of the teachers, but so that they can have that knowledge and be able to talk about it, so that when they're ready to look at those final two, they really have the knowledge to look at those final two at all of the school sites.
I didn't see the parent group in the timeline. Am I missing it in the timeline?
Not in this.
Okay.
This is just
I'm like,
a
I don't
brief.
see the time. I'm like, I don't see a parent group in the time.
And again,
but I'm,
this timeline is just a snippet from
yes,
phase
and
one.
I looked in my
from
other
phase
timeline.
one, from a larger
Am I
one.
missing the other in the
It's
other timeline?
the larger one, and it's in the handbook.
Okay.
So, and again,
I missed it when I was looking. Okay, thank you.
It is in the handbook. I will
Okay.
double check to make sure it's in the timeline, but that is,
Yeah, I'm like,
that
I
is in the
couldn't find
process.
it, but I definitely could have missed it when I was just perusing this. Thank you.
Quick question on the parent committee. How are we looking to put that together?
Initially, we were going to look to have the principals recommend a name to us of someone that's involved at the school site. So we'll have a representative from each school site.
Can we also have it available that if perhaps it's out there, that if someone's interested, they can contact the district office?
Absolutely.
We have very involved community members that may or may not have children within our school, or may have perhaps a different relationship with their school leadership, and that may be interested in serving or providing feedback. So I just don't want to leave it limited to recommendations if we can avoid that, that if there's any way, if someone's really interested, that there's a conversation and see if they would be a good fit for that type of committee.
Vice President Reese, absolutely. Our goal would be is that we have a parent group too who can also get some information for, again, the filters that we're looking for, the standards that we're trying to address, so that when they look at this too, they too are looking at it with the same kind of feedback, so that we also have a chance to get their feedback, because what happens is that the committee, the steering committee of this and the group committee goes, here's the feedback we've got from the sites, here's the feedback we've gotten from teachers, here's what we've gotten from a parent group, so that we have that information for us when we make a decision at the site level, which is our preferred, and then we bring that up to the district to decide. So we're trying to make sure that when we have a core adoption process, that we've allowed a process for multiple perspectives to give us information.
Okay, so you on the screen you see a sample of our timeline for the science adoption. This today was our very first step. We're bringing you the processes from our adoption, and now we start the work. That preliminary phase, again, is assembling the committee, getting names from all of the schools. Leslie Horn, who's working with me on this timeline, is also preparing a science course on the standards for all new members. So that will be available here soon. And we're very excited. This is just our preliminary stage, but it will be an ongoing process.
Next slide. Again, thank you for letting us share it. Obviously, we have a policy on this. There's processes for this, but this, what we've done is formalize it in writing and are starting that process with you. You'll see a long, a year and a half timeline here, so that you have time to go through each of these phases and to do it diligence at a time when we're also trying to embrace appropriate social distancing and being, sensitive to all those things too. But in the middle of urgent, there's also important, and this is important, and we're going to start following this process. So again, information, and any questions or concerns we'd be happy to address.
Dr. Foley, just real quick, science is so narrow. I just want to make sure for our high schools and middle schools that
it's very content
we only have one physics teacher at each campus, or, where we may be limited on teachers that may be also involved in other things. If we can, gosh, I feel like Mr. Glover, if we can make sure that maybe we're perhaps taking something else off their plate, if I don't want to overwhelm them because of everything else that they're doing, besides everything they do, besides online, that they're the expert in their field. And now we're asking it, this is going to take some time and dedication. And obviously, when we're looking at curriculum, we want to get it right. And science is so specialized what we're asking for. And in some cases, it may be the same teacher for perhaps the physics and earth. That may be the same teacher. And so if we can just make sure we may be lifting something off of them if we need to, so that they can participate in this. Because we just don't have a large variety and they're already taking on so much. So thank you.
Yeah.
That's great. May I? Thank you, Madam President, Vice President, Acting President. Well, thank you both, Ms. Malloy and Dr. Foley, for moving this towards another step closer to being online. That's fantastic. I know you guys have been laughing at me for like 2 years, but this is not about me. I wanted teachers to understand and take seriously this huge investment. It can be millions of dollars. So you don't want to pick something and then that wasn't really what we were looking for, and then they keep buying all these supplementals. It's a huge waste of money. And if you don't have to waste money on some of those things that are duplicates, then salaries and other things that we need on our campuses can be filled. So that's why it's been so important to me, is because we can use the money to maybe whatever. Raise classified salaries somehow. If we don't have to spend it on other things. So, the other thing is, there is a lot of movement in Arizona with teachers, and especially now we're online and classrooms are empty and people are moving. It is handy as a teacher to be able to, maybe you don't have the best department head and they don't tell you that you're supposed to have X, Y, and Z. Now you can look and you can see, well, this is what I'm supposed to be using. I do not see this in my room, and where can I find it? It's really helpful, and I think you'll find it was worth the time to put that on there. So I think it's a win all around, and I thank you.
I'm thankful for the timeline. I really like to see the date and then what's expected on that date. So I just really enjoyed that, and I really thank you for your presentation. It was great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mrs. Reed?
Mrs. Kaler?
I just want to say great presentation, great timeline, and I'm just happy that Mr. Glover's happy on his way out. So that might have been even more important at this point. No, but for real, this is amazing timeline and detailed information, and something we haven't had in the past. So I very much appreciate the time that's been put forth in this entire process, something that we can apply in the future.
Perfect. Thank you. All right. With that, we will go on. We have a list of our future agenda items that we will be covering: middle school and high school course guides at our next meeting, the high school media center update at our next meeting, athletic handbook and review student eligibility clearance requirements in December, and then we get into the new year. So does anyone have anything else that they would like to add for our future agenda items? Perfect. All right, then we are going to move on to our work study. Yes, before we go on to our work study, we will take a 2-minute break. Thank you. All right, we're going to go ahead and resume for our work study. We have our demographic study. Dr. Foley, you want to start this one?
Yes. Vice President Reese, members of the board, we are excited for this next opportunity and conversation. In line with the calendar we talked about earlier with information for important decisions, we have an opportunity here for some additional information, and kind of then want to talk about, so then what do we do with this information and next steps? So I'm going to ask Dr. Fowler to kind of explain and introduce our presenters to talk about our demographic study and the information we've learned, and then we'll dive into the so what, now what, and what are we thinking about with this, what do we now do with this information?
Thank you, Dr. Foley. Vice President Reese, members of the board, I'd like to introduce Rick Brammer from Applied Economics and also Visby Karanji from Orcutt Winslow. Rick is a statewide expert in providing student population and demographic data. The study that you're going to hear tonight was originally completed early this year. The presentation, though, was delayed, like everything else, because of COVID. And so we appreciate your willingness to hear tonight. This study was actually provided to the district at no cost and sponsored by a few of our business partners. This study provides very helpful information about current projected enrollment trends in the district, and that, as Dr. Foley alluded to, that will help us with our future planning. And without any further comments, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Brammer.
Thank you, Dr. Foley. Vice President Reese, members of the board, Dr. Foley, it's a pleasure to be here tonight, share with you the results of our demographic study. I will try to be as brief as I can. I know you've got the full report. There's a lot of slides here, and the slides I have here really do a pretty thorough job of telling of what the report does. So I'll kind of go fast, and if I'm going too fast, you just holler at me, and I will definitely slow down and take some more time with it. But if we look at the scope of the study that we do, it's a pretty standard scope for us at this point, but we're focusing obviously on enrollment information, grade level distributions, other characteristics of the actual current student population. The most important in what the way we approach it is, the geographic distribution, how students relate to housing units and households, and what that tells us about where we're going in the future. And then in this day and age, one of the most important things is to look at the alternative providers that are active in and around and through and between the district. And that includes not only, of course, charter schools, but other schools in other school districts. And so it's an open playing field out there. Which is quite different than when I started doing this, 25 years ago, when if I knew how many kids lived in a neighborhood, I could tell you exactly how many were going to be at the school. And that is, introduced a whole level of complexity, and it really makes difficulty, in doing good planning work. And people like Visby have to pay the price for trying to, make things as flexible as they can because of that. The demographic characteristics, of the existing population, you're beginning to, I know you're building like crazy right now, but the end is kind of coming in sight here. Population is going to start to change a little bit. The demographic characteristics of the existing population are going to become more important, or as important at least, as how many houses are being built. We look at the age structure and the type of housing of households, family households, non-family households, renters. The main thing we focus on is the age distribution of households, because that tells me almost exactly how many school-aged people I can expect. Residential development impacts are obviously still significant at this point. They've been tremendously significant. Inventory of current projects, what we know about what's left to be built on some of the ones that are coming down the road. And then finally, we use two different enrollment projection models, one to kind of cross-check the other. And the first one is a top-down macroeconomic. How does the district fit into Maricopa County and what's happening in Maricopa County vis-a-vis the nation? And it kind of frames the projection, if you will. And then there's the second one, the bottom-up model, I call the planning grid model, and you'll see those mids in a minute. In fact, we could go to the next slide, and that way you'll have a visual while I'm kind of talking about. But the district is divided into 82 quarter section or smaller size analysis areas. And we had the privilege of serving the district back in 2012-13, and we actually created these at that point in time. And because of that, we're able to do a longitudinal look at, the distribution of change and enrollment. And that helps us a lot when we're trying to evaluate, like I said before, where particular neighborhoods are at. So we'll go to the next slide and, basically start back at the beginning. And the blue bars in this graph are 40th day head count enrollment. K-12 doesn't include preschool. The red squiggly line, which goes completely off the charts, some of you who were here probably remember the pain that caused, but that's the annual year-over-year growth rate. And so, up until last year, still, except for the 17-18 year, being positive all the way through, not only during the massive run-up in the 2000s through 2007-8, a lot of people experienced that around here. What's different about you is you kept growing, albeit at a lower rate, but all the way through the Great Recession. You never actually stopped. And that's fairly amazing. The growth since about 2013-14 has been majorly impacted by alternative providers. Your enrollment would be, several thousand students higher today if that hadn't occurred, and we'll take a look at that, how that's playing in. But a really strong showing, and right now back to what I kind of call, positive, comfortable growth. You get that 3 or 4% per year, really makes things work very nicely. Next slide, please. Next way to look at the data, kind of slice and dice who's out there, is to look at what we call grade cohorts. In this case, the average enrollment per grade in each of these 4 groups. And just like other areas that go through a really fast growth period, you see that K2 group pop out in the early 2000s. And really, that line, it's up some, but it's kind of peaked. And you start to see the other grade levels now, catching up and surpassing that. I've never seen a district where the curves stay together this long. And it's a testament to the strength of the housing market and the fact that families aren't moving in everywhere in Maricopa County, but they are here. And so we haven't seen the last of it yet, but when that K2 number starts to plateau, the rest of them are going to follow it. Since this is a move-up housing market, it could end up that in the end, like in Gilbert, you have more high school students per grade by quite a bit than you do kindergarten, first, and second grade students. But you haven't gotten to that point yet. So it's a very interesting district in that way. Next slide. Drilling down then, I talked about looking at, where kids live, and that comes from, a record for each student, no personal information, just address and what school they attend and things like that. But we're able to turn those into real world coordinates, and with the magic of geographic information systems, actually put about 95% of the kids, on the house where they live. Which gives us, like I said, really good information about student generation from particular types of housing. And since we have a history now, we can see how it's changing over time. And these dots, it doesn't show here, but they go outside of the district. We geocode all the students. 1,300 of your 13,000 students currently reside outside the district. Many of them to the east and to the south, but certainly not exclusively. Next slide. Like I said in that last slide, this is kind of what seeds these numbers, or what seeds my sub-district model. And this is just a little slice of that data. So this is from last year. And what this map is telling us is the colors, because they're not, all the grids aren't the same size, I standardize it to, students per square mile. And so the colors are telling you the density of enrollment. And you have some of the highest and some of the lowest density enrollment areas in the entire Southeast Valley. So it becomes, a little bit of a challenge sometimes when you're doing attendance area and facility planning, because the distribution is so concentrated in some areas. The little red numbers are the actual number of K-12 students coming out of each one of those boxes in 2019, 2020. So it's good information. It's more of a visual than orient yourself. But the next one is to me more interesting, which shows us, well, between that period, between our last study, which I got it wrong, it was 13-14, but anyway, and 19-20, that 6-year period. Now you can already see, in this case, the red numbers are the change in the number of K-12 students. And so you can already see the parts of the district that developed first that are already beginning to lose kiddos. But you've got to remember that also during this same period, the charter schools were growing. So it's really not necessarily that many school-aged persons left. It's that your enrollment went down by that much. And by the same token, when you look at the red areas where the increases have been, blue for cold, red for hot, people argue about that with me all the time, but that's the way I do it. But anyway, the red areas would have been redder. The growth would have been higher. So it's all kind of muted, by the fact that we've had that growth in charter schools. Next slide, please. Talk about the actual demographics of the district. Very strong component where the under 18 population is still around a third of the population of the district. Many areas I work in, it's 15 or 20% of the population. So again, still a family area. You do see a little bit of slip where especially the under 5 group is starting to lose in terms of its share of total population. And that's kind of the first hint of what's going to be happening in the elementary schools, and then, kind of eventually work its way up. A couple of kind of important takeaways also is those renter-occupied housing units are running ahead of total housing units. So in spite of the fact that most of the construction has really been single family, not all of it, and we are seeing, more renters enter the district. And in a way that actually stabilizes enrollment levels, because rental units turn over quickly and they tend to have the same kind of people in them all the time, whereas single family houses, people age in them. And enrollment will fall over time. The other big indicator that I look at is those households in the 25 to 34 and the 35 to 44 range. Those aren't the ones, you get high schoolers out of much older cohorts, but those are the ones that are really driving the kiddos, the small guys. And so again, no huge cratering, but down from 64%, in 2000 to 52% now. So the signs are there that the aging, the maturation of the district has definitely become, and that's probably going to continue to some extent and accelerate, especially later in our projection period. Next slide, please. One of the things that I talk about with everybody, and this is just birth rates. And you've heard a lot about it in the news lately. And during the recession, birth rates in Arizona fell by nearly 20%. And the number of births about 17%. And I lagged those birth years. Down at the bottom, there's a line that says kindergarten going across there. And so many of the districts that aren't growing like you are experienced pretty significant declines in kindergarten enrollment between about 2011, 12, and 16, 17 as a result of that drop. It was interesting is that after that, we had 3 years that were relatively strong, or at least the birth rate ceased to fall. And that was during the economic recovery. And every time in history when there's been a drop like this, and then the economy recovers, guess what? The birth rate goes back up. Every time in history up until right now. And the type of impacts and the young people that felt the recession in terms of their jobs, in terms of their college debt, in terms of everything, have simply just put off having families 5 to 10 years longer on average than it used to be. And because of that, you create this one-time sort of shift, and we're dealing with that gap right now. We're still waiting for 2019 data to come out, but I don't think it's going to be up. So what that means to us is that even though you're a growing area, between 2019 and 2023, as far as we know, there's less kids in the pipeline altogether. Next slide, please. We talked about the alternative providers. This dot map is kind of hard to read, I suppose, at this scale, but there are currently 10 charter schools operating in the district, enroll about 7,300 students. You're kind of surrounded too, within a mile of the outer boundary, there's another 3,600 students in those schools. And so, their enrollment over the last 9 years, this was 2010 through 2019, had increased by 6,500 students, while yours increased by 3,200 students, which means during that particular period of time, of course, they captured about 2/3 of the growth that was occurring. In addition, there are some private schools that are, serving around 1,400 students. And I think the next slide has numbers, and we're not going to spend an awful lot of time with them. In fact, maybe none, other than to see what the rate of change has been, both in district and with those accounted for that are outside the district. But what I'm getting out of it more than anything else is if you look back in 2014-15, and it was really strongly weighted towards K2, K4. And the upper grades were very small. And still in all, the districts are more competitive for high schoolers, than they are for elementary students. That is still true. But what we've seen, especially in the type and the scale of alternative providers that you've picked up here, is that it's creeping forward. And it's having a larger and larger impact even at the high school level. It's just something to keep an eye on and something that I recognized as changing. But anyway, and it's factored into the projections. And that's, it's important, I think. Next slide, please. We will talk about development, here just a little bit. There's been, several thousand housing units added over the years, but it's gotten pretty slim these days, and I'm going to make this so I can actually read it myself, where you've got, a fair amount of development obviously occurring in Cooley Station, but they're rapidly chewing through the single-family land there, and pretty soon all that's going to be left is commercial and apartment land. And so that's going to dry up pretty quickly. And aside from some sort of infill on the western border of the district and the larger acre properties, the only game really in town has become Sossaman Estates, which has really just kind of gotten going. I suspect it's going to build like wildfire. But, that's really kind of the only other major project you have coming. So we're talking about, build out. We're talking about reaching the initial, development of the district. And on the next slide, we talk about that potential going forward. And we tallied up about 7,300 more housing units that could be built in the district by all the current plans and all the vacant land that we know about. What's interesting or kind of not sort of scary is that about 2,600 of those are single-family houses and about 4,700 are multifamily, meaning apartments and townhomes. That's what I mean by multifamily. And moreover than that, where they're located, along Williams Field Road and that entry to ASU East. And I've been tracking this project since the conversion of the air base. That's how long I've been working out here. And it's always looked like that. It's always been the dream to be Mill Avenue or a Mill Avenue of sorts. And that could still definitely happen. But if it sits there very much longer, and we go into any kind of an economic slowdown, I believe you could see some of that land flip back to some different type of development too. But they've waited a long time to get what they're asking for, so they'll probably be pretty stubborn about it too. But that is the focus of where the multifamily is. And then the next slide looks at the same map, except, oh no, it doesn't. I didn't put it in. The timing map, which just shows you, I didn't put it in here, it is in the report, that basically everything is active right now, or it's going to be active very, very soon. And as a result, almost all of that you see is going to build in the next 10 years, which is why on the slide that's currently up, you see the absorption of about 7,100 housing units over the next 10 years. And it may turn out they're not all the multifamily units that we thought they were going to be, but the interesting thing about multifamily, single family is the yield of students per acre is usually fairly similar. You get more units with less bodies. And so I think we're going to have about the same impact, no matter what the exact number of housing units is. But basically looking at build out of the district, which will bring the total population of the district up to just over 100,000 people, living in about 34,000 households. And it's the households on the next slide that, and here it's just shown as the households total. Behind this, what I'm really modeling are those age groups by tenure. So owners and renters and all those different age categories. And the mixture of those is what drives that school-age population projection. So school-age population is all persons living in the district, 5 to 17, whether they go to your school or any school. That's just total number of kiddos living in the district. 0.721 per housing unit, very high. I mean, not as much higher than some of the parts of the Southeast Valley, but compared to Maricopa County, very high. Again, a family-oriented area. That last year, we enrolled 13,121 students, which left a net difference of 7,000. And an overall EP ratio, because everyone has inflow and outflow of students, of about 65%. Now, you got to realize that of the 13,100 students, 1,300 come from outside the district, which means that you're actually, last year, got 11,821 from within the district. And if you divide that number by the 20,141 persons, that gives you a capture rate. You hear people talk about a capture rate of 58.7%. So 59%. Looks a lot like Queen Creek. Areas that got behind the curve a little bit while the charters were streaking ahead. It's good and bad, the way I look at it, because it also means that there's about 8,000 additional students out there in the district that are in the offing. And, you know, right now they're with the charter schools, but even the idea or the concept of capturing back 10%, 1 in 10, that's 800 kids. So the bank is big enough that you don't have to hit it big.
One second. As we go on in this presentation, are we going to have a conversation during this presentation as what are the thoughts are in reference to capture? Or is this the time now to have that conversation? Okay.
It is a work study, and I'm sorry that I rattled on. I was...
No. We have a great program here in the Higley School District, and what I feel is we don't tell the story enough. As you said, the capture rate, we're not doing enough to go after that capture rate. When we look at it, it's not business as usual, and the more that we sit here and we think, okay, people move into the neighborhood, how do we even talk to those families? It's non-existent. It's interesting to watch that the colleges and universities have recruiters.
Yes.
Come into the high schools to recruit students to come to them. Yet in our environment, which is new, I mean, technically, as I see it, we should really have recruiters that, I mean, for what it would cost us to bring, just as an example, okay, I'll just talk about it for a second. as an example, if we paid one full-time employee to be a recruiter, the amount of money they could bring into this district, I mean, the person that could go and meet with the realtors, meet with the new developers, a new person comes in the community. They used to call it a welcome wagon a long time ago.
Yep.
When you came to a house, person moved in, they got this whole bag of new ideas. They talked about the schools and things like that. I mean, we need to be a little creative here because, like you said, there's 7,000, 8,000 students that are sitting there and I'm looking across the street over here. There's a new subdivision going in. We need to be having conversations with those developers, with those realtors, and somebody should be visiting those houses and welcoming them to the neighborhood to ask them, because the people, what they do, I know when people move in my neighborhood, they ask their neighbors, hey, what's a good school district? Where should I go? Should I go to this school that they just built across the street, or should I go down the street here? See, that conversation is not taking place. And that's where this capture rate, like you said, I mean, you see some of the charters come in, they have bells and whistles and all these types of things. We're missing on that, and I wish we would reinvent the wheel and take a look at, be a little proactive in recruiting the children in our neighborhood. And I think that needs to be, like I even said, a recruiter or somebody in our marketing department needs to say, hey, welcome to the neighborhood, and see what takes place. But just
Mr. Tovich, that's a good point. And when people are moving from other places out of state, I actually met with a family yesterday that just moved here from California, and they said, I just have to ask, why are there so many schools? They're like, everywhere I'm turning around, they're like, what is this? Why am I driving down the street, and how come there are so many schools? What is it? And had to have that district charter conversation as non-biased as possible, but then I threw in, but we're Higley and this is what we do. So, and they're just barely expecting their first baby, but that was one of the things that they'd noticed was all the schools. And so, like you said, when people are moving in, if they're coming from out of state, somewhere different, they don't understand the difference for some between charter and district and public and what that means and everything else. So it was my assumption from what I had been told that we were sending things to new residents. Was that happening?
Vice President Reese, Board Member Witovich, I believe that when Michelle Reese was here, Dr. Thomason had shared with us that that was one of the things that they were working on doing. There were little bags that they had put together for delivering to those. To the extent of our capture rate from that or how we were doing on that, the update, I don't have an update on the return on that, but I will tell you, we're currently in the process of identifying a new public relations person, and when we went through the vetting of what are we looking for in this person and what does this role look like, we talked and hearkened in our team to the fact that, just like you had talked about with us earlier in a work study with us, is that we are our own best kept secret, and how are we going to get out there, because we pride ourselves in a boutique, and we have, for the size of district we have really great program and options, but how do we advertise and build on that? And that was one of the key pieces we were looking at. How do we do better at that? Because we do a good job of promoting to those who already know about us and not. So yes, they were doing that. To what extent that we were yielded, or what could we do more of? We are going to proceed with that, with a new direction, a new person in that role to help support us in that capacity. Because just like you see here, that 65% capture rate, how do we help capture back our students and our boundaries?
I have a quick question before you move on. I went back a few slides. I didn't want to interrupt you. You were on a roll. Do we have a higher than average number of charter schools in our district? Because it seems like we do.
Yes,
when
you do.
I drive, I feel like it's a new one every block. I mean,
I think
the
the
time I
focus,
arrived.
the focus here was not only the regular sort of market-based, the Great Hearts and those kinds of people, but, American Leadership Academy, has had a tremendous impact. And that's just the way it is.
So
and
overall,
does
we have
make
more
you different.
per square mile than other areas. Okay.
Definitely.
And then I just want to thank our Gilbert and Queen Creek for being so awesome and family friendly, because that's why people are moving here. They're hearing about our awesome schools. They're hearing about the great police officers that we have that are, safest in the nation or whatnot. So I just want to extend a thank you to them while I have a moment too. So thank you.
One of the things you might think about in that marketing message is that I find a lot of people that come here from out of state aren't familiar with the fact that the district and the city aren't the same thing. Mm-hmm. And so when you say Higley, you might say, well, maybe you should, the Higley district in Gilbert, that probably should be right part of the first sentence, because there's name recognition with Gilbert now. It sells. And so Higley, I kind of know where it is, but people, like in many parts of the country, the city council, what they call that, suspends the meeting as the city council, and they become the school board. Mm-hmm. And then they go back to becoming the city council again. And many people have come to that, and this thing with Scottsdale the other day, we got into kind of an argument, but this woman just couldn't get over the fact that the Scottsdale schools served more than the city of Scottsdale. It just wasn't a concept. The other two other things you guys said that were right on the money was, one, word of mouth is worth, all the advertising there is. But the other thing is that with the plethora of schools, I find that people who don't have the word of mouth influence go to the nearest building, and they don't really care whose name's on the door. You're going to sign my kid up? Okay, fine. They're just not that discerning to know that they're picking, a charter school over a Higley school. I don't even know that they realize it half the time.
And that's a good point about the difference in names. All of us who have run for an election, as we gather signatures and we indicate we're running for the Higley School Board, and they're like, oh, I live in Gilbert.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, what school does your child go to? And they would mention one of our schools, and we would be like, no, that's the Higley School District. And they're like, and it's confusing, and they're like, I've lived here for years, and my kid's gone here for years, and I didn't even realize that we weren't part of Gilbert Public Schools and that we had our own district and things like that. And just real quick on this, my concern, and your numbers reflect, your projections reflect a little bit of it, is, I've lived in this community for many, 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 many years. And there's a lot of families that are just like mine. And my last one's out the door this year. She's a senior. Higley won't have my kids in the district anymore. Mm-hmm. And I'm not going anywhere. I love my community. I love where we live, and everything. So, like I said, there are so many families that bought at the right time, and that recession and everything didn't harm us because of how and when we bought our homes. And so people stayed, and they're still staying, and their kids have grown up. Everybody on my street are almost original people there, and there's only one that has younger kids than mine. And so our entire street, kids have grown up and graduated, but we're not going anywhere. So we're taking up space, but not providing anything, any kids into the district,
But we certainly appreciate your taxes nonetheless. But
we won't talk about that, because I also have a small business in the district, so we won't talk about that. And I'm happy to pay them.
And we've done some longitudinal studies that show that if you take, a neighborhood, or even like say about a square mile is about the closest you can really do this, is that there's about a 30% to 40% drop between peak enrollment and the bottom of the curve before finally everybody ages out. And it's interesting because we did this as a case study, and I picked 4 different places across the valley that were like really different. McCormick Ranch and Dobson Ranch and places that have been around long enough I could do it. And they all started at different places. They had more or less kids because that's the kind of neighborhoods they were, but the slope of the curve is identical. And it really is that 30% at a neighborhood level. So what happens if you grow really fast, like you guys did in the first part of the 2000s, is you get a lot of people on the same part of the curve, which means it's going to fall even further as a district than you would if you had grown slower. You never would have peaked as high. So you do got to be careful with that. And we are in the range now of looking at enrollment peaking over the next 10 years. And it probably has peaked in the lower grades, in any real significant way. But the pressure at the middle schools and the high schools is going to continue because it's still rolling forward. And I think it's going to grow as it rolls forward because of the popularity of the area. So it's not like in the inner city district, a lot of times the most kids you have is kindergarten, and every grade from that is less. And that's not what you're going to have. It's going to be the other kind of slope. So, but it is going to peak. Maybe we can go to the next slide. I know I'm probably...
Yes, Mrs. Kaler.
Hi, I am so sorry I'm not there in person. I think all of this is very fascinating and very interesting. Can you talk for maybe a moment? There's so many apartment buildings that are going up. Is that taken into consideration that your housing, you consider that single family?
Oh yes, definitely. But with multifamily more than single family, you have to look real carefully at who it's marketed to. And most of the apartments that are planned in the district, not all, but most of them, are not being built or marketed to families with kids. They're being marketed to college students and to some extent empty nesters, but kind of not people in between. So it's very relevant. I mean, in some cases, we can have 300 or 400 units built and get, 10 or 15 kids. I mean, it's that extreme, or in some cases, none. But by looking at the rent levels and the bedroom mix, you see a lot of studios, 1 bedrooms, very few 2 bedrooms. They're not looking for kids. If you see a concierge instead of a playground, they're not looking for kids. Mm-hmm. So it's pretty, and that's what you're being characterized more and more as those that probably aren't going to have a lot of kids.
Is it also true that charter schools mostly serve K-8 students, and then most of the students would like to come back to the high schools because you have a lot more programs in the high school: sports, performing arts?
Yes, and I alluded that to a little bit when I was talking about what the charters were doing at the higher level, saying that they were growing. But as I also said, your capture rate among high school students is much higher than among K-8 students. And that's because it's truly hard to replicate what a full-service high school is with the teams and the drama and the dance and AP programs and everything that goes into that. It's absolutely correct.
Mrs. Kaler?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you.
Did you have anything else?
No, that's just my comment. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. And just a quick note on the apartments. Like you said, it depends on who they market to. Mm-hmm. Let's be real. These apartments and their cost is not being marketed to families that they're, like you said, it's not that they have 3 bedrooms that are affordable for families to come in and live. They're being marketed to either, like you said, the retirement type empty nesters or BC, before children, and that you may be able to afford a little bit higher apartment cost, because the cost of the apartments that are being built here are not being marketed to families, and that's hard for Gilbert. I love where we live and everything, and we have great schools, but it has driven the market up, and obviously as homeowners, that's great as homeowners that it's driven that housing market up, but it does make it very difficult for newer, younger, just starting out families to move here and to live here. So that's really good points.
And for sure, one of the biggest problems we face in economic development in Metro Phoenix right now is the lack of affordable housing. And we're not quite back to drive till you qualify, but when you start seeing lots of rooftops going up in Casa Grande and in Coolidge and things, you know that's essentially what's happening. On the other side of that, though, is interest rates continue to be so incredibly low that I'm quite honestly surprised at the number of kindergartners we can get out of a $500,000 or $600,000 or $700,000 house. I mean, that didn't used to be the case. You got to those kind of prices and you started thinking, oh, this is going to be junior high, high school kids, if any, or something like that. But right now, the people who are seeking the homes are the ones that have finally decided to have kids, which they decided to do 10 years later than I did, which meant they've got a lot more money to spend than I did when I was looking for a place to raise my kids. So there is a contingent out there that can afford it. And I think that's why you still have a strong school-age population. And, the popularity of your area and the quality of the schools, I believe, is going to continue to support that. So this is just a chart of that same data where we're comparing school-age population to enrollment. And, it's sort of a low level, but we see it be steady. That ratio between the two is the green line. And so it's maybe not as high as we might like it to see, but on the other hand, it's not aiming downward like it is in a lot of districts where I work. So I'm calling it, basically stable. And it gives you maybe the opportunity to even bump that up in the future, as we said, because we know, even though on here it says 7,000, that's actually based on the net number. We know there's actually 8,300 that are out there that we could potentially grab. On the next slide, we'll just try to move along. As you see the K4 group peaking in enrollment by 22, 23 or so, and it will follow the rest of the projection period. And then the other ones follow suit. So the 5-8 doesn't peak until 25, 26, maybe somewhere even later than that. And then 9-12 is still in the process of peaking when you get to the end of the projection cycle. But the other two groups, essentially will be in some level of decline by that point. And, in between, you're still gaining 2,100 students. Most of them are going to be junior high and high schoolers. Next slide. There's a couple of them, I think, but this just shows where we see the change in enrollment occurring in the first 5 years, and then the next one shows the second 5 years. And these are, again, based on counts. But you see the major slowdown in the second 5 years where you finally get, there's very few neighborhoods that are going to be increasing by that point. Most of them are going to be in some form or another of decline. And how fast that happens will be, a function of how long you decide to stay in your house, Vice President Reese. But we're all staying in our houses longer because we're living longer and we're healthier. And prices are so high that you probably can't afford to buy your own house anyway. So people are hanging in there. And so you're right, it does slow down that turnover rate. And that's going to catch up with us in enrollment. The next slide, just real quick, showing how we aggregate the grids first to attendance areas. So strictly looking at enrollment from the standpoint of where do kids live. And so the next table reflects that. So this is different enrollment numbers than you're used to seeing because this is not by school. This is by where they actually live, which also gives us that line on the table that says out of district. So you can see precisely how big that is and how it's been trending as a component of enrollment. And, right now, or in 1920, 685 from outside the district, K6, that's a school. Essentially. So it's an important component. You see the historical change we've had. The 13 to 14 changes by attendance areas are kind of wacky because we opened a school during that period of time. So, but the grand total, showed in that 6-year period about 1,100 almost new K-6 students versus only 200 7-8 students versus 677 at the 9-12 level. And as we go through the projection period, you see those earlier grades slow down in the first 5 and then actually go negative in the second 5. And the distribution, is shown again with my famous red and blue, but we're looking at most of the growth that's going to happen to continue at Gateway Point and the Higley areas, and those schools get awfully large, by the end of the projection period. And then, significant growth at both middle school areas and in both high school attendance areas. Biggest wild card in my job these days is what's going to be the future from outside of the district. I use a lot of science in what I do, and this is hardly any of it, because how many kids decide to come from you outside of the district is an extremely difficult thing to predict and beyond my crystal ball in a lot of ways. In a lot of ways, it's more in your wheelhouse than it is in mine, because it's the programs, it's the offerings, it's the public relations and the marketing that are going to drive that number. So prove me wrong and get twice that many and we'll all be happy. The next slide is the go-between, because you care about schools and I model attendance areas. So I'm always looking at what's the difference between those two. So this is a complicated slide, and you read it across to get school enrollment. So as an example, Bridges Elementary had 417 kids from their own attendance area, 29 from Centennial, 27 from Chaparral, et cetera, 77 from outside the district, giving them a total attendance of 746, even though only 438 students lived there. So they're a net positive of over 300 students. And so when we do our planning, our attendance planning, our facility planning, we have to take this into account. And when we change facilities, then we tend to upset this matrix. But I've done enough work with districts over the years to know these patterns don't change as much as you might think they do. The flow between the schools is really pretty steady. And overall, 81.1% of your elementary kids go to their designated elementary school. That's high. Paradise Valley, it's 65%. Over a third of their kids go to a different school than the one they're supposed to. And that's another thing that makes facility planning a rather interesting challenge, is when you get that. And sometimes you cause it by having a program in a particular place. And then at least you know why. Sometimes you don't even know why. The area retention rate line, the greens that go across the bottom, that just shows the share of your students from that area that attend their designated school. So in the case of Bridges, that's 95%. That's somebody saying they like that school quite a bit. And unless you're manipulating it with the program, you look across and yours are all fairly high. I don't see any that are, so low that they really stand out. But in some districts you do, and it helps identify problems. So anyway, we can read these. There's not nearly as much movement at the middle and high school level, of course, because there's only 2 schools. But there is still a difference in what it means in terms of the net enrollment, the difference between who lives there and who resides there, which is the next slide, which then takes this matrix and applies it to the attendance area projections to get projections by school. And these, have then that extra little bit of unknown in them, because we don't know if that relationship might change over time. And they generally just reflect the attendance area numbers anyway, with Gateway Point and the Higley area and the elementaries, having most of the growth. And then, growth in all of the other attendance areas, with Williamsfield High School looking like the one that's going to have the most challenges in terms of numbers of new students. So I've got a conclusion slide, and then I'll open it up, but I do think K-12 enrollment is going to peak over the next 10 years. The only way it probably wouldn't is if you do have some sort of campaign that's wildly successful and you're able to bring back kids. Because the number of new kids coming in is kind of fixed. It's going to be fixed. So, and the existing population is going to age. While saying that, there's no indication at all of immediate decrease. It's not like you're on this edge where you've got your kindergarten class is half the size of your senior class, and I have some districts where that's the case. So you know it's coming at you. You don't see that here. So you've got a lot of stability. Even though you're getting up there and you're starting that gentrification process, still a lot of stability. We know single-family construction is going to basically come to a stop over the next 10 years. And the multifamily housing that we're looking at just isn't going to be for kiddos. And the final thing, though, is that we have 2 elementaries and both middle and both high schools that might need some help in between now and then, because most of that 2,000 student increase that we're going to get in the next 10 years is going to be there, especially at the high school level. So that's kind of the end of, thankfully, I'm sure you think, of my spiel, but I'm always happy to take questions.
It's Mr. Brammer, right? It's Mr. Brammer?
Yes.
Okay. Well, thank you. This was really great and really good for the board, and I think the superintendents and the cabinets to hear. I was going to make a joke about what if I threw a pandemic in here? What would that do to your numbers? But
well, it's actually a very good comment, because what it's done is destroyed my numbers for the most part this year, because there's 50,000 students missing. Right. Statewide, 5% of all enrollment. And interestingly, 2/3 of that is K2. The kids that weren't in the system very far. But nobody really seems to know where they went, but we do expect they might come back. And you didn't really have as big a dip as some, but in some districts where we lost, 12 to 15% of kindergarten. The interesting thing is we expect them back, but in what grade? Because apparently kindergarten is not required or compulsory in the state of Arizona.
Or fully funded.
Or funded, yeah, correct. But it's unclear whether those kids will come back as kindergartners or come back as first graders. And I think it'll be a mix of both. And I think you're going to have your hands full with the ones who try to start as kindergartners who may not be quite ready. Your point about the importance of that kindergarten program.
Oh, you were listening, yeah.
Yeah. So I think it's going to cause a bump in a lot of districts next year where they're going to get a bump of kids back. You didn't lose that many, you lost a few, but it's not as big a factor here as it is in some of the other places where I work.
Thank you. And I also wanted to just add some testimony. I remember many years ago I was working in Gilbert, and one of my we got into a discussion about what's going to happen when there's a build out, and my perception, and I could be totally wrong, but my perception as a teacher is when we did start to see declining enrollment, we were in Gilbert Gilbert School District. It seemed very unprepared to deal with it, and it is very, very, very painful when you start to contract. It means moving teachers that may have been at no other school their entire career. It's just a whole slew of really unpleasant things, and my perception was that our leadership at that time had not really planned ahead, and you really have to start looking 10 years out, and not the teachers really don't have to, but the leadership of the school community has to start thinking about that, because it will really wreak havoc and destroy a lot of goodwill, and it affects programs and where people are. So this is very important. I think it's really good information. I won't be around in 10 years, but I thank you for
I just think in closing, for administration, the impact that we can have on this for positive is the marketing, okay? And I hope that's something that we take away from this workshop today, that we can make a difference here, guys. And it's all about us, and it's not about business as usual. We need to be aggressive here. I don't care if a salesman or a car salesman, but we need to be aggressive in our marketing if we're going to change his numbers in our favor. And I think that's, hopefully, is one of the takeaways from this presentation today.
Well, Mr. Glover, you asked what happens if we throw a pandemic in there. Some say there's going to be a baby boom because of everyone being quarantined and everything being locked down. So I don't know, our numbers may completely change and we may have a ton of kindergartners in 5 years that we weren't expecting. So we'll see what happens with that. But they say.
One of the things that has happened almost immediately was, of course, prior to the pandemic, we had and still have a big push for housing, urban housing, downtown kind of housing. And now all of a sudden everybody wants 2 or 3 extra bedrooms. And so we have builders scrambling to try to figure out how to build 5 and 6 bedroom houses. And that's not going to happen downtown. But it's also going to mean your house and my house, the big old houses that we no longer need, are going to be worth a fortune. I mean, it really is.
So on my street and in my neighborhood, houses are going super fast to those young families because it is the starting point, or there is this, the starting point from other states, and they're bringing their children. Because the pandemic, I don't know. I'm questioning all of it because I think we may have another big boom in Hinckley because of all the people from California coming.
There just isn't enough turnover to facilitate a big boom. Where the interest is coming from is the fact that other than the hospitality and parts of the service, sectors of the economy, Arizona economy is ripped through this. I mean, we're adding manufacturing jobs, we're adding wholesale trade jobs at an incredible rate. We're adding healthcare jobs and tech jobs at almost that higher rate. And so the attraction is here. The immigration is still here, in spite of COVID.
So President Reese, you need to move out of your house so somebody else can move into it, apparently, is what he's saying. And you got to go to an apartment, is what he's saying, Douglas. You got to move into an apartment, apparently. That's the only option for you.
Well, the developers would like you to do that. Yes, they would.
Well, and we don't see the same turnover. It used to be every 5 years, was it? 5 to 7 years, you would kind of see a neighborhood turnover.
Not that fast as a neighborhood. We used to say the average house turned over every 7 to 8 years.
And I don't think we see that.
But everybody's on a different schedule, so neighborhood-wide, it's never that extreme. But now it's 10 years.
10 years, okay.
So it's gone up by 30%, just the average.
It's at least 20 years for me, so.
I'm 26 in at my house, so
yes.
I understand.
So, well, thank you. It's great information and planning ahead and putting it all together. And our Town of Gilbert website has a lot of information that goes, coincides with this and helps, and they provide a lot of information through their Alex stuff. So I look at that, and so now I look at this, and so I definitely appreciate a heads up on what you're projecting.
Thank you. And we also do a lot of work for the Town of Gilbert, actually, on economic development and on some of the transportation planning. So Gilbert is a familiar stomping ground for us.
So is it your fault that they reduced the speed limit on Williamsfield to 25?
I'm sure it probably is.
Starting today, 25 miles an hour on Williamsfield Road?
Wait till they start ripping up Power Road south of the freeway. You're really going to love that one.
No, they permanently reduced the speed limit because of on-street parking to 25 miles an hour. So I'll keep that in mind.
Okay. I'll remember that next time.
Be like, no. All right. Thank you so much. This was great. And I appreciate, I know you've hung on to it for a while, so I appreciate you sharing that with us.
I appreciate the opportunity.
Vice President Reese and members of the board, going into 10.2, when we talk about so what, now what. So as we wanted to share with you, when Rick came to our cabinet meeting about a month ago and shared this information, our thought was, okay, so what, now what? Because when we're talking about, just to your point, Mr. Glover, when you look at, looking at, if you're not thinking several years ahead, you're already behind. So we need to kind of take a look at, when we're looking at boundaries, budgets, when we're looking at building, when we're looking at future growth, when we're looking at what are our priorities, what are our resources, what those are all going to be really important for us to consider as we bring you information and plan for, if we're going to consider going out for anything else, what does the future look like with what we know? And obviously, so then you throw a pandemic in the middle of that. So I want to ask Dr. Fowler to kind of explain kind of a thought process. Again, we're bringing this to you as an information item to decide to bring back to vote another time. If this is more information that you want to get, that would help us with prioritizing as we look at lots of needs across the district. So, Dr. Fowler, do you want to talk about our proposal then?
Yes, thank you, Dr. Foley. Vice President Reese, members of the board, really as a next step and as a cabinet, we also heard this information. One of the things that we are thinking about in terms of a next step potentially is that would assist us in our budget and planning for the future is, and that's what this proposal is, that we'll bring it back. Jeff Gadd brought the idea of the planning and the budget calendar and all those different components that need to be filled. If you take that study and some of those conclusions about we're growing to the north, we're going to have more need in two of our elementary schools, our middle schools and our high schools aren't going to be big enough. I mean, so start to look at sort of our needs facility-wise, and as you know, I've been working very closely with Mr. Reholtz over the years, and we've been very successful in getting funds from the state, and we have a pretty good idea of sort of where our next areas are and what our needs are. But what we'd really like to do is have an expert group come in and just confirm for us what those areas are, where as we look ahead and project facility needs. Certainly we want to, and the board's informed now, but want to look at what the data is telling us and certainly confirm that. As board member Wilson said as well, if they keep coming, then we will have to readjust it. But based on what we're seeing, there's certainly some areas that we need to be planning for and prepared to focus on. And it's our recommendation that we look at what Orcott Winslow could provide for us, and it's a facilities condition assessment. And that's reviewing all of our school facilities and really kind of a second opinion for us, because a lot of the big items we're going to kind of know, but then just to make sure with the experts in that field and be able to be better informed and inform the board about what that looks like. I think that would be something that would really benefit us. The other thing that I think was included in this, that is included in this, is since Rick's information is now almost a year old, it would allow him to spend a little bit of time and just update that to make sure that we've got the most current information, and we could see if there's been any changes in that. And so kind of briefly, that's what that study would provide, but really allowing us to have a second opinion, and the experts that do the condition index allow us to have some more data to make some really good detailed planning and look ahead for the next 2, 5, and ultimately 10 years in terms of what we need to do and where we need to go. So, I'll answer any other questions that are related to that.
Mrs. Reese?
Mrs. Kaler?
Thank you, Dr. Fowler. I believe this is really well spent for our district. I think that having some impartial eyes walk through our campuses and looking at everything, even myself, I walked through campus the other day and I was like, oh my goodness, this flooring, why aren't we addressing this flooring? And so I think it's just time that we have some impartial eyes walk through every campus and give us all those direct needs. I think that sometimes we focus on maybe who's screaming the loudest in our district or what they need or want, maybe more of a want than a need. And I think it's time that we on the needs of the district. I know that one of our cuts many years ago was custodians and maybe possibly maintenance, and it's time that we start really putting some money back into our schools. And we haven't done that as well as I think we'd like to, all of us. So I'm really grateful for this planning ahead and for the future. And it doesn't mean that we get everything done we need right away, but I think it's really important to put that list together starting right away.
Thank you. Just a few questions. So how often should a study like this be completed?
Vice President Reese, members of the board, I know that the last time we had this type of work done was 2012, 2013. So probably every 5 to 7 years is reasonable, but we're, I think, already at that point. So certainly for us, with the information that we have, there would be real value to look at. And as Board Member Kaler, President Kaler stated, that information and that independent opinion, because certainly we all have our biases and we're in it. So it's really nice to have that outside expert opinion, and then we can bring all that information back, certainly and present it in a study session and really get the board's input in terms of really where do we need to focus our attention and what are our greatest areas of need, and move forward that way. I do know that some of the limits that we've had certainly is budget. Also, we've been limited because we know there's things that the SFB pays for, and so some of the things that we focused on the last 5 or 6 years are the areas that we knew that we've had success with, and well, we know that the state is going to give us money for these items, so let's get all these items done. And I think we've done well in those areas, but there's a lot of things that the SFB hasn't funded and wouldn't fund, and so there's clearly some areas, and I'd be really interested in seeing this result as well, and being able to be methodical about a plan and a process of really addressing those needs moving forward. And so, but I do think it's reasonable, and Bisbee's here to chime on that, but at least 5 to 7 years, I would think is reasonable.
Think that once we create that document, it should be a living, breathing document which can sustain itself for multiple years. Because as your facilities age, and that certain things might not have already been included. So you keep on checking off the things you've taken care of, life cycle costs, like your carpet has to be replaced every 15, 20 years, your HVAC systems, depending on what systems you have, they wear down over 12 to 15 years, your roofing. And some funds come from the SFB, and Dr. Fowler and Benny have done a great job getting those funds. But SFB in this downturn is also going to be restricted in the funds they have, because I think the state is going to reduce their budget just because of the economic downturn and not enough taxes being collected. So could we then identify certain things which need to be done? Could they then be done from the bond? So you have a ongoing document, like a strategic master plan. Okay, you were able to fix the roofs and the HVAC from SFB funds, but these roofs and HVAC, the life cycle would be getting over in 2022. So how are we going to take care of them? Do we need to patch them? Do we need to go out for a bond and maybe get some bond supplement funds? And then you keep on ticking the things you've done and adding things as your facilities age. So you might have to come back and take a look at it again.
Okay, this one says the facilities condition plan was last updated in 2014. Did we have a study? Did we have that, or was that our own? And I mean, I know we created some maintenance plans regarding carpet and paint and things like that. And if that was last updated in 2014, what have we done in the last 6 years without updating our plan?
In terms of the plan that study was done right at the same time that the middle schools opened that same year. So it was the group that managed that, and so that document was provided at that time. And I think the plan was restricted because of funding, and so the document and the plan was presented. And I got it sort of after probably the third person that was in that position. But it was information that we had, but really it was never really incorporated and shared with the board and or really used to address the need. And as Visby indicated, we want to create a living, breathing document that captures all the work that we've done from different, including the SFB, but then also prioritize items that here's what we need to do, and then as we do them, put that on there. So it would be something that grows over time. And so I really do feel that there would be real value in this process. So
no, I agree. I mean, it was my understanding this is what we have been doing, as it had been talked about, not completely presented to the board, but talked about to the board that it's time for us to do this and it's time for us to do that. But if we've not really done that, I guess that's a separate thing, but we need to do that. And my other question, I think you helped answer it. My other question was, I mean, Bridges is new. Is this something we really need to be doing? But I think you answered that maybe that list at Bridges is going to be really small, but if it's a living, breathing document, as that building ages, it will start to get added things that come up. And then I'm assuming, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that obviously we're going to prioritize any safety issues ahead of anything else. I know, Mrs. Wilson, when you talked about one visit to Power Ranch, there was a concern about some doors, or maybe Mrs. Kaler, I thought you were there too, that there was some concern about doors. And so I know that became an item to take care of. So
we'll walk all of the campuses with district facilities people, and then we'll come up with a detailed list. And then usually there's a committee which is formed by the district leadership, which goes ahead and we price it, that this is potential cost for all the changes which would be. And then the district forms a committee and prioritizes on each campus, which is priority 1, 2, and 3. And life safety is number 1, because you have to fix that. And once you've identified and you don't fix it, then liability comes into the. And then anything which affects education, like you have a air conditioning coming on, and it affects the hearing of the students, so they cannot learn in a classroom. That becomes important. Leaks. Sometimes water leaks to the walls or to the roofs. We need to identify. So anything which affects education is also a very important priority, because then the kids can't learn or cannot be taught. So we identified those different items, prioritize them, and then you can kind of put them into separate bond packages. That do we want to go for a small, medium, or large bond? And then that comes back to the board, and it's a decision which you would take on how to proceed with that. We also identified these items, what funding we can go and get from SFB, because they paint the schools, they do roofing, they do HVAC upgrades, chiller upgrades. So ADA is a upgrade which we can go and ask the SFB to pay for. So there are certain categories we said these are potential SFB costs, and try and get those fundings from the SFB. But if they turn you down, then what are the other avenues remaining to get those things fixed?
President Reese.
No, I was just, that's great to be able to identify different revenue sources, like if not this, then this. And then, yes, we're going to have some areas that we need to address in the future with some growth. Mm-hmm. However, like Mr. Glover mentioned too, we're also going to have some declining areas. And what do you do? And how much do you spend? And it looks like some of that growth may be just a temporary through a curve growth, so it's not a permanent thing. And so having all that information and having options to talk about what our buildings look like and what are some temporary versus permanent options for future influx is really good to have.
Many years ago, we did that for Kyrene School District, where my kids went to. And going to different schools, we also found out that what are the district standards, that you need 1 science lab or 2 computer labs. And we saw that as in Kyrene, like Rick also did all the demographic reports, their enrollment is actually declining. They are filling up and staying steady by out-of-district kids coming in. Because of their, like you, they have a good, strong educational reputation. So what we found that in some schools, they had 3 computer labs and they had a classroom being used as a storage space. And now why add new classrooms and why not come up with different district standards? But you only need 2 labs. So now if you're growing, we are going to take that storage you're using for classroom and actually becomes a classroom. So we went through each of those campuses, meeting with the principals and identifying like a space analysis that how much capacity is there in your actual school and have you reached that capacity? And if not, then your growth can be absorbed by your existing spaces. You don't need new spaces there.
Vice President Reese, members of the board, that was the thoughts and questions that we had as a cabinet when we took a look at this information. It's nice to know those numbers. Obviously, there's some things that are going to change, but when we look at if our middle and high schools on the north side of the district is going to need some additional classroom spaces, those are obviously going to be some priorities. When our thoughts are, in addition to the information that our own department had on what has been done, what were the priorities. Our thought was it would be nice to have an outside source to say, here's an index. Yes, Dr. Fowler and his team can also walk the buildings for a programmatic use, but what is the capacity? So when there's only so much money and so many decisions that need to be made. And so our thought is we need to take a look at what do we know, what are we seeing as far as growth going? What do we anticipate with knowing that there are pandemics that get in the middle of this, but as we look at processes and systems, what is our long-term plan so that we can be thinking out multiple years ahead and be smart with it, not just reactionary based on need without thinking through, again, the maintenance and wellness and the ongoing support of the current facilities, but any other space needs that will be in the near future that we can see and project. So our thought is that this little additional report may give us some more information for us. And again, if approved, they said this would take them about 8 weeks to do so that we would have that information when we're talking about priorities. An update on the impact COVID had on our enrollments and projections, and a facility index, as well as a facility conditions index, as well as the capacity to then mirror on top of what Dr. Fowler and his team have done, so that we can make some priorities and decisions on what's most important and our greatest need. And as we make these important budgeting decisions, hence the conversation about bringing this multiple times, because these are conversations and discussions we need to be having.
Mrs. Reese?
Mrs. Kaler?
I just want to reiterate again that I think one of the biggest things that I find important in this is the safety issues of our schools too. Mr. Lotzenheiser and I were walking in the hallway the other day, and we were just kind of like shocked that something was awry. And so again, sometimes it just takes these impartial new eyes to look at our campuses with a different view. So again, I haven't been able to hear every conversation. I apologize. This phone connection is not perfection. But again, I fully support us doing this and making these lists and making sure that we are planning ahead and having this information in case we have to go out for anything in the future to our community too, having this public and being very forthright about what are the needs very specifically to our some of our aging campuses. So Thank you again for this very detailed presentation, gentlemen.
Can I just add one thing to that, Vice President Reese, members of the board, is that, remember I talked about how if you grow really fast, you have to overbuild to have a seat for everybody. Well, the other thing that happens when you grow really fast is all your schools are the same age. And so if you don't understand and get ahead of the curve that SP's talking about, it'll eat you alive, because you're going to have 5 or 6 schools that all need the same thing at just about the same time. So when you had a rapid growth period like you all had, it's really important to understand what the backside of that looks like. So I don't know anything about what he does, but I know that the dollars add up really fast.
That's a good point, because Higley almost once a year was opening a school. I mean, because we were growing really fast. So they are only a year or two apart for several of our schools. And so you're right, they're aging at the same pace. And so thank you. Any other questions or comments? No, I appreciate this. And Dr. Foley, again, I can't thank you enough. I've been saying practices, processes, we need to plan, we need to know what we're looking for, and we need to have a process to know what we're looking for, because otherwise we don't know, and then we're looking and we're looking, and then we forget we're looking, and then we're looking again. So I appreciate Mr. Gadd putting the timeline, the calendar together, and you're making sure your team's working really hard on these processes. And I think that's so important, and I appreciate it so much. That's what I've said for many, many years, that we need these processes so we know what we're doing, when we're doing it, how we're doing it, why we're doing it, and when we need to do it again. I so appreciate that, and I think this is the first step in the right direction to really get a grasp on our buildings and our district, and knowing who's coming, what's coming, how's coming, who's going, who's not going, and things like that. So I think this is a great opportunity, and we have the opportunity to be ahead of the curve, take Mr. Glover's advice, and plan ahead for multiple scenarios. So thank you for putting this together. I appreciate it. And if nobody else has anything else, we will go on, and I will move that we adjourn.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
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 Motion carries 5-0. Have a good evening.
Good night.
Good night.